Ostracism. Someone stops replying to your texts. At first, it's nothing. They're busy. But hours turn into days, and that silence starts pressing down. You check your phone constantly. You replay the last conversation, hunting for what went wrong. The absence of a response becomes louder than anything they could have said. This is what happens when you're being ostracized, deliberately ignored, treated as if you don't exist. It's one of the oldest punishments humans have used, and it cuts deeper than most people realize. Being shut out doesn't just hurt your feelings. Your brain processes it the same way it processes physical pain. The power comes from what it takes away. Connection isn't optional for humans. It's wired into survival. For most of history, being cast out from the group meant death. That wiring is still there. When someone shuts you out now, your brain reads it as danger, even when you're perfectly safe. What makes it worse is the uncertainty. Direct rejection gives you an answer. Ostracism gives you nothing. No explanation. No endpoint. Just the not knowing. And your mind fills that void with the worst possibilities. You weren't worth their time. You did something unforgivable. You don't matter. The damage goes deeper than hurt feelings. When people acknowledge you, even to criticize you, you still exist to them. But when they act like you're not there, something fundamental starts to erode. You begin questioning whether you have value, whether anyone should see you at all. And it spreads fast. One person in a group chat stops responding. Then another. Suddenly you're watching a conversation happen without you. At work, colleagues talk around you. Plans get made, and you're not mentioned. Each moment feels small, but they pile up into a wall you can't break through. The effects show up immediately. People who are ostracized lose their sense of belonging. Their self-worth drops. They feel like they've lost control. Even brief exclusion does this. They perform worse on simple tasks. Their emotions become harder to manage. They start scanning every interaction for signs of rejection, bracing for the next one. Some people respond by trying harder. They reach out more, laugh louder, make themselves useful, anything to be seen again. Others pull back completely, shutting down before they can be hurt again. Both reactions come from the same desperate need, to matter in someone else's world again. Ostracism doesn't need words. It doesn't need confrontation. It just needs silence. And that silence, if it goes on long enough, starts making you feel like you're vanishing. Rejection sensitivity. A friend takes an hour to reply to your text. Just an hour. Most people wouldn't think twice. But if you have rejection sensitivity, that hour feels like proof. Proof that they're pulling away. That you're bothering them. That they're finally seeing what's wrong with you. Rejection sensitivity means your brain is always scanning for signs that someone is about to leave. It's not about being dramatic or insecure. It's a pattern learned from being rejected too many times before. Your mind becomes hypersensitive to anything that could mean rejection, real or not. And once you start seeing those signs everywhere, they shape everything you do. It comes from experience. When you've been excluded, dismissed, or abandoned repeatedly, especially early on, your brain learns to stay on guard. It's trying to protect you. But that constant vigilance doesn't make rejection hurt less. It makes it hurt more. You're braced for the blow before it even comes, and that anticipation amplifies the pain. Here's how it works in real time. You walk into a room already expecting to be overlooked. A friend glances at their phone mid-conversation, and your mind registers it as disinterest. Someone pauses before answering, and that pause becomes hesitation, which becomes rejection. These tiny moments that most people wouldn't notice get magnified into confirmation that you're unwanted. The cruel part is that this sensitivity often creates the rejection it's trying to avoid. When you're constantly on edge, your behavior shifts. You might cling to people, seeking reassurance that ends up pushing them away. Or you pull back first, rejecting them before they can reject you. You test relationships, watching for signs they're fading, and those tests themselves can damage what you're trying to protect. In romantic relationships, it shows up as needing constant validation. Your partner takes a few hours to text back, and it spirals into anxiety about whether they're losing interest. They make plans without you, and it feels like abandonment. You read rejection into normal behavior, and your reactions strain the relationship until the fear becomes reality. At work, it turns neutral feedback into harsh criticism. Your manager sends a brief email, and it feels like disapproval. You're not chosen for a project, and it confirms you're not valued. You hold back ideas, afraid they'll be dismissed. And that holding back keeps you from advancing, which reinforces the belief that you were never good enough. It's exhausting. You're constantly analyzing interactions, searching for hidden meanings, preparing for the worst. A casual comment gets replayed for hours. A slight change in someone's tone becomes a crisis. Your emotional life revolves around the fear of rejection, leaving no room for anything else. And because most people don't understand how intense this feels, it isolates you further. They don't see why you're hurt by something small. They pull away from the intensity, which confirms what you feared all along, that you're too much, that you're unlovable. The cycle tightens. What keeps rejection sensitivity alive is that it operates on its own logic. You expect rejection, so you notice every possible sign. And when you notice it everywhere, your expectations feel validated. You're not imagining things. You're just seeing what's really there. Except you're not. You're seeing reality filtered through a brain that learned, long ago, that rejection is always waiting. And until you recognize that pattern, every silence, every pause, every delay will feel like the beginning of the end. Social exclusion. Groups of their own gravity. Walk into a room where everyone already knows each other, and you feel it instantly. The inside jokes you don't get, the shared references that fly past you. The way conversations shift when you try to join. You're physically present, but socially invisible. That's exclusion at work, and it doesn't need anyone to actively push you out. The group just closes around itself, and you're left on the outside. Social exclusion is what happens when the collective decides you don't fit. It's more than one person ignoring you. It's the group operating as if you're not part of it. And that collective rejection hits differently than being shut out by an individual. Because when a group excludes you, it's not just one person's opinion. It feels like consensus. Like everyone has agreed you don't belong. The mechanism is subtle. No one needs to say you're not welcome. They just stop inviting you. Stop including you in plans. Stop turning toward you when they talk. The exclusion happens through absence, through what doesn't happen rather than what does. And that makes it harder to confront, harder to fix. You can't point to a single moment where someone rejected you. It's 1,000 small moments that add up to being on the outside. What makes group exclusion particularly damaging is that it attacks your social identity. Humans don't just want to belong. They need to. Your sense of who you are is partly built from the groups you're part of. When a group shuts you out, it's not just rejecting your presence. It's rejecting your claim to that identity. You thought you were part of this. You were wrong. It shows up everywhere. At work, your team has lunch without mentioning it to you. At school, classmates form study groups and you're not asked. In friend circles, plans get made in a chat you're not in. Each time, the message is the same: you're not one of us. And the more it happens, the more you start pulling back, isolating yourself before the group can exclude you again. The psychological toll is severe. People who experience chronic social exclusion report higher rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness. They struggle with self-esteem. They have trouble trusting new relationships. Because once you've been excluded by a group, you start seeing every new social situation as a potential repeat. You walk in already braced for rejection, and that awareness makes it harder to connect, which increases the chance you'll be left out again. And here's what makes it self-perpetuating: exclusion changes how you behave. You become quieter, more hesitant, less willing to put yourself forward. You're trying to avoid drawing attention, trying not to give the group a reason to push you out. But that withdrawal makes you less visible, less engaged, easier to overlook. The group isn't actively excluding you anymore. You're doing it to yourself, preemptively retreating to avoid the pain of being shut out. Social exclusion doesn't need cruelty. It just needs indifference. And once a group decides you're not really part of it, every interaction becomes a reminder that you're standing on the wrong side of a line you can't cross. Fear of abandonment. What if everyone you care about eventually leaves? Not because of a fight or a betrayal, but just because they realize you're not worth staying for. That fear sits in the back of your mind, quiet until someone is late to meet you, or takes too long to text back, or seems distracted when you talk. Then it surges forward, turning a minor delay into proof that they're already halfway out the door. Fear of abandonment is the persistent dread that the people you love will leave. It's not a passing worry. It's a constant background hum of anxiety that colors every relationship you have. And it doesn't wait for evidence. It anticipates loss, interprets ambiguity as rejection, and braces for the moment when someone finally confirms what you've been dreading all along. The fear usually comes from experience. If you've been abandoned before, especially by someone who was supposed to stay, your brain learns that people leave. It doesn't matter if they promised they wouldn't. It doesn't matter how close you thought you were. They left, and that lesson sticks. So now, every relationship carries the shadow of that loss. You're waiting for it to happen again, and that waiting shapes everything you do. It changes how you attach to people. You might cling too tightly, needing constant reassurance that they're not leaving. You check in obsessively. You need them to prove their commitment over and over. Or you do the opposite. You keep people at a distance, never fully letting them in, because if you don't get too close, it won't hurt as much when they go. Both strategies are trying to manage the same fear, but neither one works. Clinging pushes people away. Distance guarantees you'll be alone. In romantic relationships, the fear becomes a constant test. You watch for signs they're losing interest. A late text, a cancelled plan, a moment of distraction, and your mind jumps to the worst conclusion. They're pulling away. They're rethinking this. They're about to leave. And your reaction to that fear, whether it's anger, withdrawal, or desperate reassurance seeking, can strain the relationship until the abandonment you feared starts to feel inevitable. The cruelest aspect is how the fear validates itself. You're so afraid of being left that you either demand too much or offer too little. Either way, the relationship struggles. And when it does, your fear tells you it was right all along. They were always going to leave. You were never enough to make them stay. The pattern repeats, and each time it does, the fear grows stronger. People with abandonment fear often describe feeling like they're always bracing for impact. Even in good relationships, even when things are stable, there's a part of them waiting for the collapse. They can't fully relax into connection because connection feels temporary. Conditional. One mistake away from dissolving, and the exhaustion is real. Living with that level of vigilance, constantly scanning for signs someone is pulling away, constantly managing the terror of being left, drains you. It takes energy that could go toward actually building the relationship and redirects it into defending against a loss that hasn't happened yet. The fear doesn't protect you from abandonment. It just makes sure you never feel safe, even when you are. Silent treatment. You've done something wrong, though you're not sure what. And instead of telling you, they've gone silent. Not temporarily quiet. Not just needing space. Completely, deliberately silent. They won't answer your calls. They don't respond to messages. If you're in the same room, they look past you as if you're not there. The silence isn't neutral, it's weaponized. And it's designed to make you feel exactly what you're feeling right now: desperate, confused, and willing to do anything to make it stop. The silent treatment is ostracism used as punishment. It's not passive. It's an active choice to withhold communication, affection, and acknowledgement until you comply, apologize, or break. And what makes it so effective is that it puts all the power in the hands of the person staying silent. You're left guessing what you did, how to fix it, and how long the punishment will last. They don't have to explain. They just have to wait for you to crumble. It works because humans are wired to resolve conflict, not endure it. When someone goes silent, your brain treats it as a threat. You need to repair the connection, but you can't do that without communication. So you're stuck in a loop, trying to fix something you don't understand, while the other person's silence confirms that you're failing. The confusion and helplessness are the point. They're the mechanism of control. The silent treatment shows up in relationships as a way to enforce dominance without having to argue or justify. One partner shuts down, and the other scrambles to appease. It appears in families where a parent withdraws affection to punish a child's disobedience. It happens in friendships, where one person goes cold to signal displeasure without ever explaining what went wrong. In every case, the pattern is the same: silence as control, emotional withdrawal as leverage. What makes it particularly insidious is that the person using it can deny responsibility. They're not doing anything. They're just not talking. If you complain, they can claim you're being unreasonable, that they're allowed to take space, that you're making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. But there's a difference between needing time to cool down and deliberately freezing someone out as punishment. One is self-regulation. The other is manipulation. The psychological damage accumulates. If you're on the receiving end repeatedly, you start walking on eggshells. You monitor your behavior constantly, trying to avoid triggering the next round of silence. You apologize for things you didn't do, just to restore communication. You accept blame you don't deserve because the silence is worse than being wrong. Over time, your sense of self erodes. You stop trusting your own perception of what happened, and you start organizing your life around avoiding their withdrawal. And here's the trap. The silent treatment works precisely because it's painful. The person using it knows that withholding connection hurts, and they're using that pain to shape your behavior. The more you try to end the silence, the more power they have. The more you comply to avoid it happening again, the more entrenched the pattern becomes. You're not resolving conflict. You're learning to submit to control. The silent treatment isn't a communication breakdown. It's a refusal to communicate used as a weapon. And the only way to break it is to stop playing the game. Because as long as their silence controls your behavior, the punishment is working exactly as intended. Social pain. Pain is supposed to be physical. A cut, a bruise, a broken bone. Something you can point to and say, that's where it hurts. But when someone rejects you, when they exclude you or dismiss you or make it clear you don't matter to them, it hurts in a way that feels just as real. Your chest tightens. You feel it in your body. And you're not imagining that. Social pain isn't a metaphor. It's processed by the same neural systems that handle physical pain. When you experience rejection or exclusion, your brain activates regions normally reserved for physical injury. The same areas that light up when you touch something hot or stub your toe fire when someone shuts you out. That's why social pain doesn't feel like sadness or disappointment. It feels like being hurt. Because to your brain you are. The reason goes back to survival. For most of human history, being excluded from the group was a death sentence. You couldn't hunt alone, defend yourself alone, or survive harsh conditions alone. Social connection wasn't just nice to have. It was essential. So the brain evolved to treat social threats the same way it treats physical ones, as urgent, dangerous, and requiring immediate attention. Rejection hurts because pain is the brain's way of saying stop, fix this, or you won't survive. And just like physical pain, social pain has lasting effects. People who've been rejected show heightened sensitivity to future rejection. Their brains react more strongly to even minor social slights. It's similar to how an injury can leave you more vulnerable to pain in that area later. The neural pathways get sensitized. Once you've been hurt socially, your brain stays on alert, scanning for the next threat, amplifying small signals into major warnings. This overlap between physical and social pain explains why rejection can be so debilitating. You can't just talk yourself out of it. You can't rationalize the hurt away by reminding yourself it's not a real injury. To your nervous system, it is. That's why breakups, exclusion, and humiliation can feel as overwhelming as physical trauma. Your brain isn't distinguishing between the two. It also explains why some people turn to physical pain as a way to manage emotional pain. Self-harm, extreme exercise, anything that produces a clear physical sensation can temporarily override the diffuse, unmanageable ache of social rejection. It gives the brain something concrete to focus on, a pain with a source and a solution, rather than the shapeless hurt of being unwanted. The intensity of social pain varies, but it's universal. Infants cry when separated from caregivers because the separation activates their pain systems. Adolescents experience peer rejection as acutely painful because their brains are hypersensitive to social feedback. Adults feel the sting of exclusion even when they understand, intellectually, that it shouldn't matter. The pain isn't a sign of weakness or oversensitivity. It's a fundamental feature of how human brains are wired. And here's what that means. When someone tells you to just get over rejection, or that you're taking it too personally, they're asking you to override a system designed to keep you alive. Social pain is real. It's measurable. It leaves marks not on your skin, but in the patterns of your brain. And ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just forces you to carry an injury no one else can see. Ghosting. They were there yesterday. Texting back, making plans, acting like everything was normal. Then nothing. The conversation just stops. No explanation. No goodbye. They don't block you. They just disappear. You send another message, then another, watching the read receipts or the lack of them, wondering what happened. But deep down, you already know. They're not coming back. They've ghosted you. Ghosting is rejection by vanishing. It's choosing to end a connection by simply ceasing to exist in someone's life. No closure, no conversation, no acknowledgement that anything even happened. And what makes it particularly brutal is the uncertainty it creates. You're left with questions that will never be answered. Did you do something wrong? Did they lose interest? Were you ever important to them at all? The digital age made ghosting effortless. Before, ending a relationship required a conversation or at least avoiding someone in person. Now you just stop replying. Stop opening messages. Let the silence do the work. It's the easiest form of rejection to execute and one of the hardest to endure, because the person being ghosted doesn't get to move on. They're stuck in limbo, waiting for an answer that isn't coming. What amplifies the damage is that ghosting denies you the ability to process what happened. Closure isn't just about ending things cleanly. It's about understanding why something ended so you can make sense of it and move forward. When someone ghosts you, they take that possibility away. You're left replaying every interaction, searching for the moment it went wrong, constructing explanations from nothing because you need some kind of reason. And the reason you create is almost always worse than the truth. You assume it was something about you. That you were too much, too boring, too needy, not interesting enough. The lack of information forces your mind to fill the gap, and it fills it with the worst possible interpretations. Because if there was a good reason, they would have told you. Their silence means it's something you can't fix, something fundamentally wrong with who you are. Ghosting happens in romantic relationships, but it's not limited to that. Friends ghost each other. Colleagues disappear after leaving a job. People you thought were solid connections just fade without explanation. In every case, the pattern is the same: presence, then absence, with no transition in between. And that abruptness makes it feel less like a choice they made and more like you stopped mattering enough to deserve an explanation. The aftermath lingers. People who've been ghosted become hypervigilant in future relationships. They overanalyze response times. A delayed text triggers anxiety. They brace for the vanishing act, expecting people to disappear without warning because it's happened before. The trust doesn't fully return. Every new connection carries the possibility that this person, too, might just stop existing one day. And here's the cruelest part: ghosting works because it's easy for the person doing it. They don't have to face your reaction. They don't have to explain themselves. They don't have to feel uncomfortable. They just stop, and you're left holding all the weight of an ending that never officially happened. You can't confront someone who's gone. You can't get closure from silence. You just have to accept that you mattered so little. They couldn't even be bothered to say goodbye. Belongingness threat. Your brain can detect a threat to your social standing faster than you can consciously process it. Someone's tone shifts slightly. A group goes quiet when you approach. You're left out of a conversation happening right in front of you. You haven't fully registered what's happening yet, but your body already knows. Your heart rate increases. Your focus narrows. You're on alert. Because your brain has picked up a signal that your place in the group might be at risk. This is belongingness threat, the immediate psychological response to cues that your social connection is unstable. It doesn't wait for confirmation. It doesn't need proof. A small shift in how people interact with you is enough to activate a threat response designed to protect your position in the social hierarchy. And once that alarm goes off, it's hard to ignore. The system evolved for survival. For most of human existence, losing your place in the group meant losing access to resources, protection, and mates. Being excluded wasn't just socially painful. It was dangerous. So the brain developed an early warning system, constantly scanning for signs that your social bonds are weakening. A look, a tone, a lack of acknowledgement. Tiny signals that most animals wouldn't even notice, but humans are wired to catch. The response is automatic. You don't choose to feel threatened. Your nervous system makes that call for you, and it's biased toward false alarms. It would rather see a threat that isn't there than miss one that is. So it overacts. A friend being distracted gets interpreted as rejection. A colleague's neutral tone feels like disapproval. You're not being paranoid. Your brain is just doing what it's designed to do: protect your social standing at all costs. What makes this response so disruptive is that it doesn't turn off easily. Once you've detected a belongingness threat, your attention locks onto it. You start monitoring that person more closely, analyzing their behavior, looking for more signs that you're losing status or connection. And that hypervigilance often creates the exact problem you're worried about. You become tense, defensive, or withdrawn. Your anxiety makes the interaction awkward, which pushes the other person away, which confirms your fear that the connection was unstable. In group settings, the threat becomes amplified. If you sense that multiple people are distancing themselves, your brain interprets it as coordinated exclusion. You're not just losing one connection. You're losing your place in the entire social structure. The threat escalates from personal rejection to group-level exile. And the response intensifies. You might try harder to fit in, overcompensating in ways that feel desperate. Or you might pull back entirely, rejecting the group before they can fully reject you. The exhausting part is how often the threat isn't real. Someone was distracted, not dismissive. The group went quiet for reasons that had nothing to do with you. But your brain doesn't wait for clarification. It responds to the possibility of exclusion, not the certainty. And by the time you realize there was no actual threat, the damage is already done. Your reaction to the perceived threat has altered the dynamic, and now you're managing a problem that your own alarm system created. Belongingness threat keeps you vigilant. But vigilance has a cost. You can't relax into connection when part of your mind is always scanning for signs you're about to lose it. The threat response, designed to protect your place in the group, ends up undermining the very connections it's trying to preserve. Shunning. The community you were part of has made a decision. You're out, not subtly, not gradually, completely. People who used to greet you now look away. Conversations stop when you enter a room. No one will sit with you, work with you, or acknowledge your presence. You haven't been physically removed, but socially you've been erased. This is shunning, and it's one of the most organized, deliberate forms of exclusion humans have created. Shunning isn't one person deciding to ignore you. It's a coordinated group effort to cut someone off entirely. It's used by religious communities to enforce conformity, by social groups to punish violations, and by families to respond to betrayal. The mechanics are simple. Everyone agrees to treat the person as if they no longer exist. The punishment isn't just isolation. It's the experience of being surrounded by people who have collectively decided you don't matter. What makes shunning particularly brutal is its totality. Ostracism can be partial. One person might ignore you while others don't. Shunning is comprehensive. The entire group participates. There's no one left to turn to, no one who will break ranks to offer support. The isolation is absolute, and the message is clear: you violated the group's standards, and this is the price. The psychological impact is immediate and severe. Humans are built to monitor their social standing. When an entire community rejects you at once, it doesn't just hurt. It destabilizes your sense of identity. You defined yourself, in part, by your membership in this group. Now that membership has been revoked, and with it, a piece of who you are. The rejection isn't just social. It's existential. And the group knows this. Shunning works because it exploits a fundamental human need: belonging. The threat of being shunned keeps people in line. The experience of being shunned is designed to be so unbearable that you'll do almost anything to be let back in. You'll apologize. You'll change your behavior. You'll conform to rules you might have questioned before. Anything to end the isolation. The cruelty is in the silence. No one explains what you need to do to be accepted again. No one tells you how long the punishment will last. You're left guessing, performing compliance, hoping someone will notice and decide you've suffered enough. But the group maintains its silence, and that silence becomes its own form of control. You're not just being punished for what you did. You're being trained to never do it again. For some, the shunning is temporary. Perform the right acts of contrition, and eventually, slowly, the group lets you back in. But the experience leaves a mark. You know now that your place in the group is conditional. That it can be taken away, completely, if you step out of line. The fear of being shunned again shapes every interaction. You're more cautious, more compliant, more careful not to give anyone a reason to exclude you. For others, the shunning never ends. They're permanently exiled, left to rebuild a life outside the group that once defined them. And even then, the impact persists. Because shunning doesn't just remove you from a community, it teaches you that communities can't be trusted. That belonging is fragile. That acceptance is always one mistake away from total withdrawal. Attachment anxiety. You're in a relationship, and logically, you know things are fine. Your partner hasn't done anything wrong. They care about you. They've told you they're not leaving. But logic doesn't stop the anxiety. You need reassurance. Constantly. A text to confirm they still love you. A call to make sure nothing's changed. Physical closeness to prove they're not pulling away. And even when they give you what you need, the relief lasts only until the next wave of doubt crashes in. This is attachment anxiety, a pattern of fear and hypervigilance within relationships. It's not about whether the relationship is actually unstable. It's about an internal alarm system that's always detecting instability, real or imagined. And once that system is activated, it doesn't turn off. You're stuck in a loop: fear of abandonment, seeking reassurance, temporary relief, then fear again. Attachment anxiety typically starts early. If your caregivers were inconsistent, sometimes available and sometimes not, your brain learned that closeness is unpredictable. You couldn't count on them being there when you needed them, so you developed strategies to manage that uncertainty. You stayed vigilant. You monitored their moods. You worked harder to keep them close, and those strategies carried forward into every relationship you've had since. As an adult, attachment anxiety makes you hypersensitive to signs of disconnection. Your partner is quieter than usual, and your mind immediately jumps to the worst conclusion. They're losing interest. They're rethinking the relationship. They're about to leave. You don't wait to see if your fear is justified. You act on it. You seek reassurance, ask if everything's okay, need them to prove they still want you. And here's where the cycle becomes self-reinforcing. The more anxious you are, the more you seek closeness. But that need for closeness can feel overwhelming to your partner. They need space, not because they're pulling away, but because the intensity is exhausting. So they create distance, which your anxiety interprets as confirmation that they're leaving, which makes you cling harder. The very behavior designed to keep them close pushes them away. Attachment anxiety also distorts how you interpret your partner's actions. A neutral comment feels like criticism. A need for alone time feels like rejection. You're constantly scanning for evidence that the relationship is in trouble, and when you're looking for problems, you find them, even when they're not there. Your partner can be fully committed, and you'll still feel like you're losing them because the fear isn't coming from them. It's coming from a place inside you that learned long ago that people leave. The exhaustion is real. You're not just managing the relationship. You're managing the constant fear that the relationship is about to end. It takes energy to monitor every interaction, to seek reassurance, to soothe the anxiety that keeps spiking. And it takes a toll on the relationship itself. Partners of people with attachment anxiety often feel like nothing they do is enough. They reassure you, and the anxiety returns. They prove their commitment, and you still doubt it. What makes attachment anxiety so persistent is that it's rooted in a survival mechanism. Your brain learned that closeness is unreliable, and it's trying to protect you from future abandonment by staying alert. But that protection comes at a cost. You never get to fully relax into the relationship. You're always braced for loss. And that constant bracing makes it almost impossible to experience the security you're desperately seeking. Romantic rejection. You told them how you felt, and they said no. Not in a cruel way. Not with malice. Just no. Just no. They don't see you that way. They're not interested. And in that moment, something inside you fractures. Because romantic rejection doesn't just mean they don't want to date you. It feels like a verdict on who you are. That you're not attractive enough, not interesting enough, not worth wanting. Romantic rejection hits differently than other forms of rejection. When a friendship ends or a job application is rejected, it stings, but it doesn't cut as deep. But when someone rejects you romantically, it strikes at the core of how you see yourself. Because romantic interest is tied to desirability, and desirability is tied to worth. When someone says they're not attracted to you, your brain hears it as a statement about your value as a person. The pain is immediate and visceral. Studies show that romantic rejection activates the same brain regions involved in physical pain. It's not a metaphor. Your nervous system is processing the rejection as an injury. And just like physical pain, it's hard to ignore. You can't logic your way out of it. You can't rationalize the hurt away by reminding yourself it's just one person's opinion. The pain is there, and it demands attention. What makes it worse is the way rejection warps your self-perception. Before, you might have had a decent sense of who you are. After rejection, that sense becomes unstable. You start questioning everything. Your appearance. Your personality. The way you talk, the way you move, the things you find interesting. Because if they didn't want you, maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with you. Maybe you're not as attractive, charming, or valuable as you thought. And the damage compounds if it happens repeatedly. One rejection can be written off as incompatibility. 2 starts to feel like a pattern. 3 or more and it becomes proof. Your brain builds a narrative of you're not the kind of person people want. You're destined to be rejected. And that narrative shapes how you approach future relationships. You enter them already braced for rejection, expecting it, and that expectation changes your behavior in ways that make rejection more likely. Romantic rejection also carries a social dimension. When someone rejects you, especially if others know about it, there's a layer of humiliation. You made yourself vulnerable, and they turned you down. Now you have to face them, and anyone who knows what happened, with the knowledge that you weren't wanted. The rejection becomes public, and that public dimension makes it harder to recover. You're not just dealing with private pain. You're managing the social fallout of being rejected. The aftermath varies. Some people withdraw, deciding that putting themselves out there isn't worth the risk. They protect themselves by not trying, by keeping their feelings hidden, by never making themselves vulnerable enough to be rejected again. Others keep trying, but they carry the weight of past rejections into every new interaction. They're quicker to see signs of disinterest, more likely to interpret ambiguity as rejection. The scars don't heal cleanly. What makes romantic rejection particularly cruel is that it's often arbitrary. Attraction is subjective. Timing matters. Someone might reject you not because of who you are, but because of where they are in their life, what they're looking for, or factors that have nothing to do with your value. But when you're on the receiving end, it doesn't feel arbitrary. It feels personal, like they looked at you, saw everything you are, and decided it wasn't enough. Perceived burdensomeness. You need help, but you don't ask for it. Not because the help isn't available, but because you're convinced that asking would make you a burden. Your friends are busy. Your family has their own problems. Your partner already does enough. The last thing they need is you adding to their load. So you handle it alone, even when handling it alone is crushing you. Because being a burden feels worse than struggling in silence. This is perceived burdensomeness, the belief that your existence, your needs, and your presence weigh others down. It's not based on what people have said or done. It's a conclusion you've reached on your own, often despite evidence to the contrary. People might offer help, express care, or invite you to lean on them. But you filter those gestures through a lens that says they're just being polite. That they don't really want to deal with you. That you're already taking up too much space in their lives. The belief builds slowly. Maybe you asked for help once and felt like you inconvenienced someone. Maybe you noticed a flash of irritation when you brought up your problems. Maybe no one explicitly said you were too much, but you sensed it. And from those small moments, you constructed a rule: you're a burden, and the best thing you can do is minimize the weight you place on others. So you start pulling back. You stop sharing your struggles. You downplay your needs. When someone asks how you're doing, you say fine, even when you're not. You handle things alone, not because you prefer it, but because you've decided that involving others would be unfair to them. You're protecting them from the burden of you. But here's the damage that belief causes: it isolates you. Relationships are built on reciprocity, on both people being willing to need each other and help each other. When you refuse to let anyone support you, you cut off half of that exchange. They can't get close to you because you won't let them in. And over time, they stop trying. Not because you're actually a burden, but because your refusal to be vulnerable makes connection impossible. And the isolation reinforces the belief. You're alone now, handling everything by yourself, and that confirms what you suspected all along. People don't really want to be involved in your life. They're relieved you stopped asking. You were right to pull back. Except you weren't. You created the distance you feared, and now you're living inside the proof of your own prophecy. Perceived burdensomeness also distorts how you interpret other people's behavior. When someone offers help, you assume they're doing it out of obligation, not genuine care. When they check in on you, you think they're just being polite. You can't accept that people might actually want to support you, because that would contradict the belief that you're too much. So you dismiss the evidence that you matter, and hold on to the belief that you don't. The belief becomes dangerous when it extends beyond thinking you're a burden to thinking others would be better off without you. That your presence in their lives is net negative. That they're suffering because of you, and the kindest thing you could do is remove yourself entirely. This is where perceived burdensomeness shifts from painful to lethal. Because it's not just about feeling like you're too much. It's about feeling like you're actively harming the people you care about by existing. What makes perceived burdensomeness so persistent is that it's self-sealing. You don't ask for help, so no one helps you, which confirms you were right not to ask. You pull away so people stop reaching out, which confirms they didn't really want you around. The belief creates the reality it expects. And the longer it runs, the harder it becomes to see that the weight you're carrying isn't the burden. The belief that you're a burden is. Public humiliation. Everyone is watching. That's what makes it unbearable. You made a mistake, said something wrong, did something embarrassing, and now it's out there. Not privately. Not in a one-on-one conversation where you could explain or apologize. Publicly. In front of people who will remember. Who will talk about it? Who will define you by this moment for longer than you want to think about? Public humiliation isn't just about being wrong or embarrassed. It's about being exposed in front of an audience, and that audience changes everything. When you mess up privately, the damage is contained. You deal with one person's judgment. But when it happens publicly, you're facing the collective gaze of a group, and that gaze doesn't just observe. It evaluates. It judges. It remembers. The psychological impact is severe because humans are wired to care intensely about their social reputation. For most of history, your standing in the group determined your survival. Being publicly shamed could mean losing status, losing allies, losing access to resources. That ancient calculus still runs in your brain. When you're humiliated in front of others, your nervous system treats it as a social emergency. Your heart races. Your face flushes. You want to disappear. What amplifies the damage is that public humiliation is permanent in a way private mistakes aren't. The people who witnessed it will carry that memory. They'll bring it up later. Reference it in jokes. Use it to define who you are. You become the person who did that thing, and no amount of competence or kindness afterward fully erases it. The humiliation becomes part of your identity in their eyes. And you know they're remembering. That's the part that doesn't go away. You walk into a room and wonder if people are thinking about it. You participate in a conversation and worry that someone will make a reference. The humiliation happened once, but the awareness that others witnessed it continues indefinitely. You're carrying the weight of their judgment long after the moment has passed. The social dynamics shift. People treat you differently. Some might be sympathetic, but others distance themselves. Being associated with someone who was publicly humiliated carries risk. It suggests poor judgment, instability, weakness. So they pull back, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation, and that withdrawal compounds the damage. You're not just dealing with the humiliation itself. You're dealing with the social fallout. The response varies. Some people try to recover by doubling down on competence, proving they're more than that one moment. Others withdraw entirely, avoiding situations where they might be humiliated again. Some attempt humor, making jokes about the incident to diffuse its power. But none of these strategies fully neutralize the experience. The memory remains. The awareness that you were judged and found lacking in front of others doesn't fade cleanly. And here's the lasting impact. Public humiliation teaches you that visibility is dangerous. That putting yourself out there, trying something new, taking a risk, opens you up to being torn down in front of an audience. So you start playing it safe. You avoid situations where you might fail publicly. You keep your head down. You don't volunteer ideas or take chances. The humiliation doesn't just hurt in the moment. It reshapes how you move through the world, making you smaller, quieter, less willing to be seen. Interpersonal rejection. Not all rejection is the same. Losing a job feels different from being turned down for a date. Failing an audition isn't the same as having a friend tell you they don't want to see you anymore. The context changes the sting. But interpersonal rejection, the kind that happens between people in direct relationship, cuts in a way that impersonal rejection doesn't. Because it's not about your skills or your qualifications. It's about you as a person being deemed unwanted. Interpersonal rejection happens when someone you know, someone you've interacted with, someone who's seen who you are, decides they don't want you in their life. It could be a friendship ending, a romantic relationship dissolving, a colleague making it clear they don't want to work with you. The specifics vary, but the core is the same. They know you, and they're choosing distance. What makes this form of rejection particularly painful is that it's personal in a way other rejections aren't. When a company rejects your application, you can tell yourself they never really knew you. They saw a resume, not a person. But when someone rejects you interpersonally, that defense doesn't work. They did know you. They saw your personality, your quirks, your flaws, and they decided it wasn't enough. Or worse, it was too much. The rejection forces you to confront questions you'd rather avoid. What is it about me that made them leave? Was I too intense? Too boring? Too needy? Not interesting enough? The lack of clear answers makes it worse. Most people won't tell you the real reason they're pulling away. They'll give you something vague, something polite, and you're left filling in the blanks with your worst assumptions. And those assumptions stick. You carry them into future relationships. You become hyper-aware of the traits you think caused the rejection. If you believe you were too much, you start holding back. If you think you weren't interesting enough, you try to perform being more engaging. You're not just being yourself anymore. You're being a version of yourself edited to avoid triggering another rejection. Interpersonal rejection also damages your ability to trust. If someone who knew you chose to leave, what's stopping the next person from doing the same? You start seeing relationships as temporary, conditional, one mistake away from ending. You don't fully relax into connection because connection feels fragile. And that wariness makes it harder to build the closeness you're craving, which increases the likelihood of future rejection. The aftermath doesn't resolve quickly. You replay conversations, searching for the moment it started to fall apart. You analyze your behavior, cataloging everything you did wrong. You imagine alternate versions where you said different things, acted differently, and maybe they stayed. But none of that changes what happened. They're gone, and you're left trying to make sense of why you weren't worth keeping. What makes interpersonal rejection so difficult to recover from is that it attacks the core of how you see yourself in relationships. You thought you were the kind of person people wanted around. The rejection says otherwise. And that contradiction doesn't resolve easily. You can rationalize it, tell yourself it was about compatibility or timing, but part of you will always wonder if the problem was simply you. Relational aggression. Watch how power moves through a group, and you'll notice it doesn't always announce itself. There's no shouting, no direct confrontation. Just small, strategic actions designed to damage someone's social standing without leaving fingerprints. A rumor spread quietly. An invitation withheld. An alliance formed that excludes one person. Relational aggression operates through manipulation of social bonds, and it's devastatingly effective because it's hard to call out and harder to defend against. Relational aggression is harm delivered through relationships. It's using social connection as a weapon. Instead of attacking someone directly, you undermine their friendships, spread information that damages their reputation, exclude them from groups, or turn others against them. The aggression is indirect, but the damage is real. And because it doesn't look like traditional aggression, it often goes unaddressed. The mechanics are subtle. Someone starts a rumor, framing it as concern. They exclude you from plans, claiming it was an oversight. They give backhanded compliments that sound supportive but leave you feeling diminished. Each action alone seems minor, easy to dismiss. But together, they systematically erode your social position. And because the aggression is covert, you can't point to a single moment and say, "This is what they're doing." It's happening in the margins, in the spaces between direct interactions. What makes relational aggression particularly insidious is that it weaponizes trust. The person engaging it often maintains a friendly front. They smile at you. They act supportive in public. But behind the scenes, they're working to isolate you. They tell others things you said in confidence, framing you as unstable or difficult. They form alliances that leave you on the outside. And when you try to address it, they deny it. You're being paranoid. You're imagining things. They would never do that. The impact compounds because relational aggression targets your social network, not just your relationship with one person. When someone spreads rumors about you, they're not just damaging their view of you. They're influencing how others see you. When they exclude you, they're not just removing themselves from your life. They're signaling to the group that you're not worth including. The damage spreads beyond the initial aggressor, and the social dynamics make it hard to fight back. If you confront the person directly, you look aggressive. If you try to defend yourself to others, you look defensive. The structure of relational aggression puts you in a position where any response makes things worse. So most people stay quiet, enduring the slow erosion of their social standing because speaking up feels more dangerous than staying silent. The psychological toll is significant. You become hypervigilant, monitoring every interaction for signs of manipulation. You stop trusting people's motives. You second-guess friendships, wondering if someone is genuinely supportive or gathering information to use against you later. The aggression doesn't just damage your current relationships. It makes you wary of future ones. And here's what makes it self-perpetuating: relational aggression works because groups often tolerate it. They see the surface-level friendliness and miss the underlying manipulation. Or they notice it but don't intervene because getting involved feels risky. So the person engaging in relational aggression continues, unchecked, while the target loses ground socially. The aggression isn't just interpersonal. It's structural, enabled by a social environment that prioritizes harmony over accountability. Thwarted belongingness. What happens when you can't find your people? Not for lack of trying. Not because you're avoiding connection, but because every attempt to belong ends in friction, misunderstanding, or quiet exclusion. You show up. You participate. You try to fit in. But something never quite clicks. You're there but not really part of it. You're included, but not truly belonging. And over time, that gap between wanting to belong and being unable to find a place that fits becomes its own kind of pain. Thwarted belongingness is the experience of having your need for connection consistently blocked. You want to belong. You seek out groups, relationships, communities. But the belonging doesn't materialize. Either you're rejected outright, or you're conditionally accepted but never fully integrated. You're on the periphery, close enough to see what real belonging looks like, but unable to access it yourself. The need to belong isn't optional. It's wired into human psychology. People who lack meaningful social connection experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, and physical illness. Belongingness isn't just about feeling good. It's about survival. Your brain treats the absence of connection as a threat because, for most of human history, it was. Being isolated from the group meant vulnerability. So when belonging is repeatedly thwarted, your brain registers it as ongoing danger. The pattern usually starts with effort. You reach out, you try to join, you make yourself available. But the responses are lukewarm. People are polite, but they don't invest. Invitations are rare. Conversations stay surface level. You're not excluded exactly, but you're not pulled in either. And that ambiguity is exhausting. You're left wondering if you're doing something wrong, if there's something about you that makes people hesitant to let you in. What makes thwarted belongingness particularly painful is that it's not a single rejection. It's a pattern of rejection. One group doesn't work out, so you try another. That one fades too. You meet new people and the same dynamic repeats. Over time, the pattern starts to feel like proof. Maybe the problem isn't the groups. Maybe it's you. Maybe you're fundamentally unsuited for the kind of belonging other people seem to access easily. And that belief reshapes how you approach connection. You start by rejecting yourself, pulling back before others have a chance to exclude you. You stop trying as hard because trying and failing hurts more than not trying at all. You settle for shallow connections because deep ones feel impossible. The need to belong doesn't go away, but the hope of meeting that need dims. The isolation accumulates. You watch other people build tight-knit groups, form close friendships, create the kind of social bonds that feel secure and reciprocal. And you're outside of that, not by choice, but because every attempt to create it for yourself has stalled. The lack of belonging becomes a constant background ache, something you learn to live with because fixing it feels beyond your reach. Thwarted belongingness doesn't just hurt emotionally. It changes behavior. People who experience chronic thwarted belongingness become more withdrawn, more defensive, more likely to interpret ambiguous social cues as rejection. They're protecting themselves from further disappointment, but that protection makes connection harder, which reinforces the cycle. The need remains unmet, and the strategies for meeting it stop working. Social defeat. You lost. Not in a game. Not in a competition that doesn't matter. You lost in a way that repositions you in the social hierarchy, and everyone saw it happen. Maybe you challenged someone and they outmaneuvered you. Maybe you tried to assert yourself and were shut down. Maybe you competed for status and came out lower. The specifics vary, but the result is the same. Your social position dropped, and the group witnessed it. Social defeat is the experience of losing status in a visible, undeniable way. It's not just about failing. It's about failing in a context where status is at stake, and the outcome reshapes where you stand relative to others. The defeat is public, and that public dimension locks it in. You can't walk it back. You can't pretend it didn't happen. Your position in the hierarchy shifted, and everyone knows. The psychological impact goes beyond the immediate moment. Social defeat triggers a cascade of responses that mirror the biology of dominance and submission. Your stress hormones spike. Your confidence drops. You become more vigilant, more cautious, more aware of your lowered status. It's not just in your head. Your body is responding to a change in your social standing, and that response affects how you interact with the group going forward. What makes social defeat particularly damaging is that it's self-reinforcing. Once your status drops, people treat you differently. They're less likely to defer to you, less likely to seek your opinion, more likely to challenge or dismiss you. And those interactions confirm your lower position, which affects how you see yourself, which affects your behavior, which further cements the status loss. The defeat also changes your risk tolerance. After a visible loss, you become more conservative. You avoid situations where you might lose again because another defeat would push you even lower. You stop competing for status. You stop asserting yourself. You accept a lower position in the hierarchy because trying to climb back up feels too risky. The defeat doesn't just lower your status, it keeps you there. And the memory doesn't fade quickly. The group remembers who won and who lost. That memory shapes future interactions. You might recover some ground over time, but the defeat remains part of how people see you. You're the person who lost that challenge, who got outmaneuvered, who couldn't hold their position. That history influences how much weight people give your voice, how much respect they show, how much they see you as someone with power or someone without it. Social defeat also affects who you connect with. After a status loss, you're more likely to affiliate with others at a similar or lower level. Not because you prefer their company, but because higher status individuals are less accessible. They don't seek you out. They don't invite you into their circles. Your defeat has marked you as lower in the hierarchy, and social structures tend to reinforce those divisions rather than dissolve them. The long-term impact is that social defeat teaches you where you stand. And if that lesson is repeated, if you experience defeat multiple times, it shapes your baseline sense of your own social value. You start seeing yourself as someone who loses, someone at the bottom, someone whose status is always vulnerable. That self-perception becomes a filter through which you interpret every social interaction, and it makes climbing back up feel not just difficult, but impossible. Emotional abandonment. They're still here, physically. You see them every day. You live in the same house, work in the same place, exist in the same space. But emotionally, they're gone. They don't engage. They don't ask how you're doing. They don't offer comfort or interest or presence. You talk, and they're somewhere else. You reach out, and there's nothing there. The relationship still exists on paper, but the emotional connection has been severed, and you're left in a strange kind of limbo where you're together but completely alone. Emotional abandonment is what happens when someone withdraws their emotional presence while maintaining the relationship structure. They haven't left. They're just not there. And in some ways, that's harder than a clean break. Because you can't grieve the end of the relationship. It's still technically happening. But you're grieving the loss of connection within it, and that loss is harder to name and harder to resolve. The withdrawal can be gradual or sudden. Sometimes it happens after a conflict, when one person shuts down emotionally and never fully opens back up. Sometimes it's a slow drift, where attention and care erode over months or years until there's almost nothing left. But the result is the same: you're in a relationship with someone who's emotionally absent, and that absence creates a void that's impossible to fill. What makes emotional abandonment so painful is that it denies you both connection and closure. If they left, you could process the loss and move on. If they stayed and engaged, you'd have the relationship you want. But emotional abandonment gives you neither. You're stuck in a relationship that exists in form but not in substance. And you can't fix it alone. You need the other person to re-engage, and they're not willing or able to do that. The abandonment often shows up in small, consistent ways. They stop asking about your day. They don't remember things you've told them. They're physically present during conversations, but clearly not listening. They withdraw affection, stop initiating contact, and respond to your attempts at connection with minimal effort. Each moment alone is small, but together they communicate a clear message: you're not a priority. Your emotional needs don't matter. They've checked out. And because the abandonment is emotional rather than physical, it's easy for them to deny. You try to talk about it, and they point out that they're still here. They haven't left. They're doing their part. But presence without engagement isn't a relationship. It's cohabitation. and no amount of physical proximity compensates for emotional absence. The impact on you is profound. You feel unseen, unheard, like you're screaming into a void and getting nothing back. You start questioning whether your needs are reasonable, whether you're asking for too much, whether the problem is you expecting connection that isn't realistic. The abandonment makes you doubt yourself, your perceptions, and your right to want emotional presence from someone who's supposed to care. Over time, you adjust. You stop reaching out because it hurts to be met with nothing. You stop sharing because there's no point when the other person isn't listening. You create distance to protect yourself from the repeated experience of being ignored. And that distance widens the gap, making the relationship even more hollow than it already was. Emotional abandonment doesn't always end the relationship. Sometimes people stay for years in emotionally abandoned partnerships, living parallel lives, going through the motions, maintaining the structure while the substance has long since disappeared. The abandonment becomes the new normal. You learn to expect nothing, need nothing, and survive on the edges of a connection that exists only in name. Fear of exclusion. Before the meeting even starts, you're already calculating who's going to be there, how the group will split, whether you'll be part of the conversation or quietly edged out. It's not paranoia. It's pattern recognition. You've been excluded before, and your brain learned to watch for the signs. Now every social situation carries the possibility of being left out, and that possibility shapes everything you do. Fear of exclusion is the anticipatory dread of being shut out from a group. It's not about whether exclusion is happening right now. It's about whether it could happen, and that potential alone is enough to trigger anxiety. Your brain doesn't wait for proof. It scans for threats, and in social settings, the threat it's looking for is being on the outside. The fear operates on a hair trigger. Someone looks away while you're talking, and your mind registers it as disinterest. A group laughs at a joke you don't understand, and it feels like a signal that you don't belong. These small moments get amplified because your brain is primed to detect exclusion. It's trying to protect you by alerting you early, but that constant vigilance means you're always on edge. What keeps the fear alive is uncertainty. You never know for sure whether you're truly included or just tolerated. Are people inviting you because they want you there, or because it would be awkward not to? Are you part of the group, or just adjacent to it? The ambiguity is exhausting, and because you can't resolve it definitively, the fear persists. The fear changes how you behave in groups. You might overcompensate, trying too hard to fit in, laughing too loudly, agreeing too quickly. Or you might hold back, staying quiet to avoid drawing attention that could lead to judgment. Neither strategy works. Trying too hard makes you seem desperate. Holding back makes you invisible. But the fear keeps pushing you toward one extreme or the other, because doing nothing feels even riskier. In work settings, the fear shows up as reluctance to voice disagreement. If you challenge the group consensus, you might be seen as difficult, and being difficult is a step toward being excluded. So you stay silent, even when you have something valuable to say. The fear of exclusion doesn't just limit your social comfort. It limits your contribution. In friendships, the fear makes you hyper-aware of shifts in dynamics. If two people in the group get closer, you worry you're being pushed out. If plans are made without you even once, it feels like the beginning of permanent exclusion. You're not just enjoying the friendship. You're constantly monitoring it for signs that's about to end. And the exhausting part is that the fear creates the very dynamic it's trying to avoid. Your anxiety makes you act differently. People pick up on that. They sense your discomfort, your need for reassurance, your constant monitoring. And sometimes that energy pushes them away. Not because they wanted to exclude you, but because the fear made the interaction strained. The vigilance that's supposed to protect you ends up isolating you. Evaluation apprehension. You're about to speak, and suddenly you're aware of every pair of eyes on you. Your heart rate climbs. Your thoughts scatter. The thing you were about to say, which seemed fine a moment ago, now feels inadequate. Because you're not just sharing an idea. You're being evaluated. And the possibility that you'll be judged poorly, that people will think less of you, is enough to make you hesitate or stay silent entirely. Evaluation apprehension is the anxiety that arises when you believe others are assessing your performance, intelligence, or competence. It's not about actual criticism. It's about the potential for judgment. And that potential doesn't need to be explicit. Just knowing that people are watching, listening, or forming opinions is enough to activate the response. The anxiety spikes in situations where performance matters. Presentations, meetings, conversations with people whose opinions carry weight. Anywhere the outcome could affect how you're perceived. And once the apprehension kicks in, it becomes self-sabotaging. You're so focused on avoiding mistakes that you make more of them. You stumble over words. You forget points you wanted to make. The anxiety about being judged poorly makes poor performance more likely. What makes evaluation apprehension particularly difficult is that it targets competence, which is tied to self-worth. When you worry about being judged, you're not just concerned about looking bad in the moment. You're worried about what that judgment says about your value. If they think you're incompetent, unimpressive, or not as smart as you seemed, it confirms fears you've been carrying about not being good enough. The apprehension also distorts how you interpret feedback. Neutral comments feel like criticism. Someone asking a clarifying question feels like they're pointing out a flaw. You're scanning every reaction for signs of disapproval, and when you're looking for it, you find it. Even when the feedback is genuinely positive, the apprehension makes it hard to believe. You assume people are being polite, that they're not saying what they really think. In group settings, evaluation apprehension keeps you quiet. You have ideas, but you don't share them because you can't be sure they're good enough. You wait for someone else to say something similar first, so you can gauge the reaction before committing. But by the time that happens, the moment has passed, and you've stayed silent. The apprehension doesn't just limit what you say, it limits your presence in the group. The long-term impact is that evaluation apprehension narrows your willingness to take risks. You avoid situations where you might be judged. You stick to what you know you can do well. You don't volunteer for challenges because the possibility of being evaluated and found lacking feels too dangerous. The apprehension keeps you safe from judgment, but it also keeps you stuck. And here's the trap: the more you avoid evaluation, the less practice you get handling it. The anxiety doesn't decrease. It intensifies. Because now, on the rare occasions when you do put yourself in a position to be judged, the stakes feel even higher. The apprehension becomes a barrier that grows stronger the more you try to avoid crossing it. Peer rejection. You're in school, or maybe it's work, but the dynamic is the same. There's a group, and you're not part of it. You eat lunch alone or with people who aren't really friends, just whoever else got left out. You're picked last for teams. You're not invited to the hangouts everyone else seems to know about. And the rejection isn't from adults or authority figures. It's from your peers, people your own age who've decided, collectively or individually, that you don't fit. Peer rejection is exclusion or dismissal by people at your social level. It's different from being rejected by someone in authority because peers are supposed to be your equals. Their rejection doesn't come with formal power. It comes with social power, and in some ways, that cuts deeper. Because when your peers reject you, the message isn't that you broke a rule or failed a standard. It's that you're not someone they want around. The impact is particularly severe in adolescence, when peer acceptance feels like everything. Your sense of identity is forming, and a lot of that formation happens through social feedback. If your peers accept you, you learn that you're likable, valuable, worth including. If they reject you, you learn the opposite. And those lessons stick. People who experience significant peer rejection in childhood or adolescence carry those patterns into adulthood. Peer rejection often starts with small signals. You're left out of a conversation. You're not chosen as a partner for a project. You sit alone while others cluster together. Each instance might seem minor, but they accumulate. And because peer rejection tends to be consistent rather than isolated, it creates a clear status: you're the one who doesn't belong. What makes peer rejection especially painful is that it's often arbitrary. You didn't do anything terrible. You're just different in some way that makes you a target. Maybe you're quieter, or you have different interests, or you don't pick up on social cues as quickly. The rejection isn't about you doing something wrong. It's about you being outside the norm, and kids are ruthless about enforcing norms. The rejection shapes behavior in lasting ways. You learn to be invisible, to avoid drawing attention, to never stand out because standing out means being noticed, and being noticed led to rejection. Or you go the opposite direction, becoming the class clown, the troublemaker, anything to get some form of attention because negative attention feels better than being ignored. In adulthood, the patterns continue. People who were rejected by peers are more likely to struggle with social anxiety, more sensitive to signs of exclusion, quicker to assume they're not wanted. They walk into new social situations already expecting rejection, and that expectation makes them behave in ways that can trigger it. The cycle that started in childhood keeps running, and the cruelty is that peer rejection often happens at a stage when you have the least power to escape it. You can't leave school. You can't avoid the people rejecting you. You're stuck in close proximity to a group that's made it clear you don't belong, and you have to navigate that reality every single day until you age out of it. The rejection isn't just painful. It's inescapable. Abandonment schema. Some people walk into relationships expecting them to last. They trust that people will stay, that connection is stable, that closeness doesn't automatically lead to loss. But if you have an abandonment schema, that's not your experience. You walk into relationships expecting them to end. Not hoping they will. Expecting it. Because in your history, people left. And your brain built a framework around that reality, a schema that says abandonment is inevitable, and every relationship is just a countdown to when it happens again. A schema is a mental framework, a pattern your brain uses to make sense of the world. An abandonment schema specifically is the deeply held belief that people will leave you. It's not a passing fear. It's a core assumption about how relationships work. And once that schema is in place, it filters every interaction, every relationship, every moment of closeness through the lens of anticipated loss. The schema usually forms early. Maybe a parent left. Maybe caregivers were inconsistent, sometimes present and sometimes not. Maybe you experienced a significant loss that taught you closeness is temporary. Your brain took those experiences and built a rule: people leave. And now, even in relationships where there's no sign of abandonment, the schema tells you it's coming. What makes the schema so persistent is that it's self-confirming. You expect abandonment, so you test the relationship. You push people away to see if they'll stay. You create conflict to check if they'll leave. And sometimes they do leave. Not because they wanted to originally, but because the constant testing, the suspicion, the inability to trust became too exhausting. The abandonment happens, and your schema says, "See, I was right. They always leave." The schema also changes how you interpret behavior. Your partner needs space, and the schema translates that as the beginning of withdrawal. A friend is busy for a week, and the schema says they're pulling away. You can't take actions at face value because the schema is always looking for evidence that abandonment is imminent. And when you're looking for it, you find it, even when it's not there. In relationships, the abandonment schema creates a painful paradox. You want closeness, but closeness feels dangerous because the closer you get, the more it will hurt when they leave. So you keep people at a distance, or you cling so tightly that you suffocate the relationship. Either way, the schema undermines the connection you're trying to build. The schema doesn't just affect romantic relationships. It shows up in friendships, in professional relationships, in any context where connection matters. You assume people will lose interest, stop calling, move on. And that assumption makes you defensive, withdrawn, or overly accommodating. You're managing the relationship around the inevitability of its end rather than engaging with it as it actually is. Breaking an abandonment schema is difficult because it requires challenging a belief that feels like fact. Your brain has evidence. People have left. The schema protected you by preparing you for that reality. Letting go of it means accepting vulnerability without guarantees, trusting that someone might stay even though your history says they won't. And that kind of trust, for someone with an abandonment schema, feels like walking off a cliff. Social snubbing. You walk up to a group and the conversation just stops. Not naturally, abruptly. They were talking and now they're not, and the silence makes it clear you're the reason. Or maybe they keep talking, but they angle their bodies away from you, closing the circle. You're standing there, but you're not included. That's a snub, a deliberate social slight designed to signal that you're not welcome without anyone having to say it directly. Social snubbing is exclusion through gesture, not words. It's turning away, ignoring a greeting, failing to acknowledge someone's presence. Each action alone might be deniable, but together they send a clear message: you don't belong here, and we're not going to pretend otherwise. What makes snubbing effective is its ambiguity. If someone tells you to leave, you can respond. But a snub doesn't give you that opening. They didn't say anything. They just stopped talking, or looked away, or didn't invite you. You can't call it out without seeming paranoid or oversensitive. So you're left absorbing the rejection with no way to address it. The psychological impact is immediate. Your status in the group has just been publicly lowered. Everyone saw you approach, and everyone saw the group close you out. It's not just rejection. It's humiliation. Because the snub happens in front of witnesses, and those witnesses now know you've been deemed unworthy of basic social courtesy. Snubbing often serves a social function. It enforces hierarchy. It punishes violations of group norms. It signals to others where the boundaries are. If you've been snubbed, it's usually because you've crossed a line the group cares about, or because you're seen as low status and snubbing you reinforces that position. The snub isn't personal in the sense that it's about individual dislike. It's strategic. It's the group managing its internal dynamics by making an example of you. The damage compounds because snubbing is often repeated. Once a group has snubbed you successfully, they're likely to do it again. You become the person it's acceptable to ignore. And each time it happens, your position in the social structure drops a little further. You're not just excluded. You're marked as excludable. And here's what makes snubbing particularly cruel: it forces you to participate in your own exclusion. You approached the group. You tried to join, and they made you stand there uninvited until you walked away. You're not just being rejected. You're being made to feel the weight of that rejection in public, with no recourse and no dignity. Relational devaluation. You thought you mattered to them. You invested time, energy, care. You showed up when they needed you. You made the relationship a priority, and then something shifts. They're less available, less responsive. The warmth that used to be there has cooled. You can feel it, but you can't name it. What's happening is relational devaluation. They've reassessed your importance, and you've been downgraded. Relational devaluation is the experience of being treated as less valuable in a relationship than you once were. It's not a clean break. It's a gradual decrease in how much effort, attention, and care the other person invests in you. They're still in your life, but their level of engagement has dropped. and that drop signals that you matter less to them than you did before. The shift can be subtle. They take longer to respond to messages. They're less interested in your life. They don't make plans with you the way they used to. Each change alone might seem insignificant, but together they create a pattern. You've been deprioritized. You're no longer in their inner circle. You've moved from close to peripheral, and that movement hurts because it's a judgment on your worth to them. What makes relational devaluation particularly painful is that it's often unspoken. The other person doesn't sit you down and tell you your value to them has changed. They just act differently. And because it's not explicit, you can't address it directly. If you bring it up, they can deny it. Claim you're imagining things, insist nothing has changed. But you're not imagining it. The devaluation is real. You just can't prove it. The devaluation forces you into a difficult position. Do you pull back to match their reduced investment, protecting yourself from further hurt? Or do you try harder, hoping to reclaim the closeness you had? Neither option feels good. Pulling back confirms the distance. Trying harder often just makes the imbalance more obvious. In romantic relationships, devaluation often precedes a breakup. One partner starts withdrawing affection, attention, time. They're preparing to leave, consciously or not, and the devaluation is part of that process. By the time the relationship officially ends, they've already emotionally exited. The person being devalued is the last to know, left trying to resuscitate a connection that the other person has already let go of. In friendships, devaluation can persist indefinitely. The friendship doesn't end. It just becomes shallow. They still consider you a friend, but you're not a priority. You're someone they see occasionally, talk to when convenient, remember when they need something. The relationship continues, but the depth is gone. And you're stuck deciding whether a devalued friendship is worth maintaining or whether you'd rather let it fade entirely. The long-term impact of relational devaluation is that it erodes your confidence in your own worth. If someone who knew you well decided you were worth less, what does that say about you? The devaluation doesn't just end one relationship. It shapes how you see yourself in all of them. You start wondering if other people will devalue you too. If everyone, eventually, will realize you're not as valuable as they initially thought. The devaluation becomes internalized, and you carry that diminished sense of worth into every relationship that follows. Rejection expectancy. You know how this ends before it even starts. You meet someone new, and instead of optimism, you feel a countdown beginning. They seem interested now, but you're already waiting for the moment they pull away. You enter the relationship expecting rejection, not because you want it, but because expecting it feels safer than being surprised by it. At least if you see it coming, you can brace for impact. Rejection expectancy is the anticipation that rejection is inevitable. It's not hope. It's not fear exactly. It's certainty. You've been rejected enough times that your brain has stopped asking if it will happen and started asking when. And that shift from possibility to inevitability changes everything about how you engage with people. The expectancy functions as a prediction your brain treats as fact. When you expect rejection, you start seeing evidence for it everywhere. A delay in a text response means they're losing interest. A distracted moment during conversation means they're checking out. Normal fluctuations in attention and availability get interpreted as the early stages of withdrawal. You're not being paranoid. Your brain is just confirming what it already believes is true. What makes rejection expectancy so damaging is that it becomes self-fulfilling. When you expect someone to reject you, you behave differently. You might pull back emotionally, keeping them at a distance to protect yourself. Or you might test them constantly, watching for signs they're about to leave. Either way, your behavior creates strain. And eventually, that strain can push them away, not because they wanted to leave originally, but because the relationship became exhausting to maintain. The expectancy also limits how much you invest. If you're certain the relationship will end, committing fully feels foolish. So you hold back. You don't share as much. You don't let yourself care as deeply. You're protecting yourself from the pain of rejection by never fully engaging in the relationship. But that protection comes at a cost. You're experiencing a diluted version of connection, always keeping part of yourself separate, always preparing for the loss. In romantic relationships, rejection expectancy shows up as reluctance to be vulnerable. You don't talk about your feelings. You don't ask for what you need. You avoid deep conversations because depth creates attachment, and attachment makes rejection hurt more. Your partner might want closeness, but you can't give it to them because giving it would mean accepting the risk that they'll eventually take it away. At work, the expectancy manifests as avoiding visibility. You don't put yourself forward for opportunities because being selected means you could later be passed over. You don't build close professional relationships because those relationships might end when someone leaves or gets promoted. You're operating from the assumption that any position you gain is temporary. Any connection you form is fragile. And here's the trap: rejection expectancy doesn't protect you from pain. It just guarantees you'll experience a version of rejection even when it's not happening. You reject yourself preemptively. You withdraw before anyone else can. You end relationships in your mind long before they actually end. The expectancy turns every relationship into a slow confirmation of what you already believed, that you're destined to be left behind. Interpersonal sensitivity. A friend's tone shifts slightly, and you catch it immediately. Not the words, the tone. Something in the way they said that last sentence feels different, and your mind is already racing through possibilities. Are they annoyed? Pulling away? Losing patience with you? You can't pinpoint what changed, but you know something did. And now you can't stop analyzing it. Interpersonal sensitivity is heightened awareness of subtle social cues. You pick up on micro-expressions, shifts in vocal tone, changes in body language that most people don't notice. It's not a superpower. It's a defense mechanism. Your brain learned to monitor social signals closely because missing them in the past led to rejection or conflict. So now you're tuned to the smallest fluctuations, constantly scanning for signs that something is wrong. The sensitivity operates below conscious awareness. You don't decide to notice these things. You just do. A slight pause before someone responds. A change in how they're standing, the way they look away a fraction of a second too quickly. These micro-signals get flagged by your nervous system as potential threats, and once flagged, they're hard to ignore. What makes interpersonal sensitivity exhausting is that it never turns off. You're monitoring every interaction, tracking every shift, analyzing every response. A casual conversation becomes a data stream you're constantly processing. You're not just talking. You're watching for signs that the other person is losing interest, getting uncomfortable, preparing to disengage. The mental load is constant. The sensitivity also creates false positives. Not every shift in tone means something's wrong. Sometimes people are tired. Sometimes they're distracted. Sometimes a pause is just a pause. But when you're hypersensitive to social cues, you interpret ambiguity as threat. A neutral signal gets read as negative. And because you're reacting to signals that might not mean anything, you create tension in interactions that were fine until you started worrying they weren't. In relationships, interpersonal sensitivity makes it hard to relax. You're always monitoring your partner's mood, their level of engagement, the warmth in their voice. A slight decrease in any of these feels like a warning sign. You ask if everything's okay, not because there's clear evidence of a problem, but because your sensitivity detected a shift. And when you ask repeatedly, the relationship becomes strained by your need for constant reassurance. The sensitivity can also make you seem high maintenance. People don't understand why you're reacting to things they barely noticed. They don't see the subtle cue you picked up on because their brains aren't tuned to detect it. So when you respond to something they didn't even register, they think you're overreacting, which makes you doubt your perceptions, but doesn't turn off the sensitivity. You're still noticing everything. You just can't talk about it without seeming paranoid. And the cruel irony is that interpersonal sensitivity developed to help you avoid rejection by catching problems early. But it creates its own problems. The constant monitoring, the overinterpretation of neutral signals, the need for reassurance when nothing is actually wrong. The sensitivity that was supposed to protect you ends up making relationships harder to sustain. Need to belong. Strip away everything else, and this is what remains. Humans need other humans. Not want, need. It's not a preference or a personality trait. It's wired into survival. Belonging to a group kept our ancestors alive. Isolation meant vulnerability. And that ancient equation, belonging equals survival, still runs in every brain. You can't think your way out of needing connection any more than you can think your way out of needing food. The need to belong is one of the most fundamental human motivations. It drives behavior from infancy through old age. Babies cry when separated from caregivers because separation threatens survival. Adults experience anxiety and depression when socially isolated because the brain is registering a threat to well-being. The need isn't optional. It's foundational. What makes the need powerful is that it operates independently of logic. You can know intellectually that you're safe alone. You can be self-sufficient, financially stable, perfectly capable of surviving without close relationships. But that knowledge doesn't silence the need. Your brain still registers the absence of connection as a problem that needs solving. The need persists regardless of your circumstances. When the need is met, you barely notice it. You feel secure. You have people you can count on. You're part of groups where you fit. The belonging fades into the background, just part of the baseline of your life. But when the need is unmet, it becomes impossible to ignore. The absence of belonging creates a psychological ache that colors everything else. Food doesn't taste as good. Accomplishments feel hollow. Nothing quite satisfies because the fundamental need for connection isn't being met. The need shapes behavior in powerful ways. People will conform to group norms they don't agree with to maintain belonging. They'll stay in relationships that aren't good for them because being in a bad relationship feels better than being alone. They'll tolerate mistreatment, compromise their values, accept less than they deserve, all to avoid the pain of not belonging. And the need makes rejection hurt more than almost any other form of pain. When you're rejected, it's not just that someone doesn't want you around. It's that a fundamental need is being blocked. Your brain treats it as a threat to survival, even when logically you know you'll be fine. The emotional response is disproportionate to the actual danger because the system triggering the response was calibrated in an environment where rejection really did mean life or death. The need to belong doesn't disappear with age or experience. Older adults experience the same drive for connection as younger ones. People who've been independent their whole lives still feel the pull towards social bonds. You don't outgrow the need. You just learn better or worse strategies for meeting it. What makes unmet belongingness so damaging is that it doesn't just create emotional pain. It affects physical health. People who lack social connection have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, weakened immune systems, increased inflammation. The need to belong isn't just psychological. It's biological. And when it's chronically unmet, the consequences show up in the body as well as the mind. Dismissive avoidance. You don't need anyone. That's the story you tell yourself, and maybe you even believe it. Connection feels optional. People get too close, and you feel suffocated. They want more from you than you're willing to give, so you keep them at a distance. Not cruelly, just consistently. You don't invest deeply. You don't rely on others. You've built a life where you're self-sufficient, and that distance feels safer than the alternative. Dismissive avoidance is a pattern of minimizing the importance of close relationships and maintaining emotional distance from others. It's not about hating people or wanting to be alone. It's about managing the vulnerability that comes with closeness by deciding closeness isn't worth the risk. If you don't get to a take, you can't be hurt when people leave. If you don't need anyone, rejection doesn't have power over you. The pattern usually forms as a defense. Maybe early relationships were unreliable. Maybe you learned that depending on people led to disappointment. Maybe closeness came with conditions, and pulling away felt like freedom. Whatever the origin, your brain decided that independence is safer than connection, and it built a framework around that decision. Needing people became weakness. Distance became strength. What makes dismissive avoidance functional in the short term is that it works. You don't get hurt when relationships end because you were never fully invested. You don't feel abandoned because you never let yourself depend on anyone. You avoid the pain of rejection by avoiding the depth of connection that makes rejection painful. The strategy protects you from a very real threat. But the protection comes with costs that accumulate slowly. Relationships stay shallow. You have people in your life, but no one really knows you. You're friendly, capable, present on the surface, but there's a core part of you that stays locked away. And that isolation, even when it's self-imposed, takes a toll. Humans aren't built for complete emotional independence. The need for connection doesn't disappear just because you've decided it's not important. Dismissive avoidance also distorts how you see relationships. You might view people who want closeness as needy or weak. You interpret their desire for connection as clinginess, their emotional needs as excessive. Because you've organized your life around not needing anyone, people who do need others seem fundamentally different from you. And that judgment creates more distance, reinforcing the pattern. In romantic relationships, dismissive avoidance shows up as an inability to commit deeply. You might be in a relationship, but you keep part of yourself separate. You don't talk about feelings. You don't ask for support. When your partner wants more intimacy, you feel pressured and pull back. The relationship exists, but it never reaches the depth your partner is looking for because depth requires vulnerability, and vulnerability contradicts your entire defense system. And here's the paradox: dismissive avoidance is designed to protect you from rejection, but it guarantees a form of isolation that feels a lot like the rejection you're trying to avoid. You're not being left by others. You're leaving preemptively over and over, in small ways that keep everyone at arm's length. The avoidance keeps you safe from acute rejection, but locks you into chronic disconnection. Exclusion Cue Hypervigilance. Your brain is scanning. Always. Always. Not consciously, but constantly. It's tracking who looked at you and who didn't. Who included you in the conversation and who talked over you. Who moved closer and who stepped back. You're monitoring the room for signs that you're being excluded, and your nervous system is on high alert for anything that suggests you're on the outside. Exclusion Cue Hypervigilance is a state of heightened attention to signals of social exclusion. Your brain has learned that exclusion is a threat, and now it's monitoring for that threat constantly. It's not paranoia. It's a threat detection system running in overdrive, flagging anything that could indicate you're being pushed out. The vigilance operates automatically. You don't decide to watch for exclusion cues. Your brain does it for you. Someone glances away while you're talking, and the system flags it. A group forms across the room without inviting you, and the alarm goes off. These signals get processed faster than conscious thought, and by the time you're aware of your reaction, your body has already responded. Heart rate up, muscles tense, focus narrowed. What makes hypervigilance exhausting is that it misses nothing. Every interaction is data. Every social moment is scanned for signs of exclusion. You're not just participating in conversations. You're analyzing them in real time, tracking who's engaged and who's drifting, who's warm and who's distant. The cognitive load is massive because you're running two processes simultaneously, the interaction itself and the threat assessment. The hypervigilance also creates a bias toward detecting threat. When you're looking for exclusion, you find it. A neutral interaction gets interpreted as cold. A distracted moment reads as dismissal. The system is calibrated to catch exclusion early, which means it catches things that aren't actually exclusion. False alarms are frequent, but each false alarm reinforces the vigilance because it confirms that you need to stay alert. In group settings, the hypervigilance makes it hard to be present. You're sitting in a meeting, but part of your attention is tracking who's making eye contact, who's nodding at your points, who seems engaged and who seems checked out. You're at a social gathering, but you're monitoring the flow of the group, noting when people cluster without you, when conversations shift and you're not included. You can't relax because the scanning never stops. The hypervigilance also affects how you interpret your own position in groups. Because you're hyperfocused on exclusion cues, you notice every small moment where you're on the outside. And those moments accumulate in your mind, building into a narrative that you're not really part of the group. Even when you're included far more often than you're excluded, the vigilance makes the exclusions feel more frequent and more significant. And the cruelty of hypervigilance is that it was designed to protect you. By catching exclusion early, you could respond before it became permanent. But the constant monitoring makes exclusion feel omnipresent. You're so attuned to the threat that you can't experience inclusion without wondering when it will end. The vigilance meant to protect your place in the group makes you feel perpetually on the verge of losing it. Self-silencing. You have something to say, but you don't say it. Not because you forgot, not because it's not important. You stay quiet because saying it feels risky. If you speak up, you might be dismissed. You might be seen as difficult. You might create conflict, and conflict could lead to rejection. So you swallow the words. You keep your thoughts to yourself. You silence your own voice to keep the peace. Self-silencing is the suppression of your own thoughts, feelings, and needs to avoid conflict or rejection. It's a strategy for maintaining relationships by making yourself smaller, quieter, less demanding. You prioritize other people's comfort over your own expression. And in the moment, it works. The conflict doesn't happen. The relationship stays smooth, but the cost accumulates in ways that aren't immediately visible. The pattern often starts as a reasonable adaptation. Maybe you grew up in an environment where voicing disagreement led to punishment. Maybe you learned that your needs were less important than keeping others happy. Maybe early attempts to speak up were met with dismissal, and you concluded that silence was safer. The brain took those experiences and built a ruler. Expressing yourself is dangerous, so don't. What makes self-silencing insidious is that it feels like a choice you're making for good reasons. You're being considerate. You're avoiding unnecessary conflict. You're keeping the relationship stable. But over time, the silencing becomes automatic. You stop even noticing when you're doing it. Your real thoughts and feelings get filtered out before they reach your mouth, and you present a version of yourself that's been edited for acceptability. The impact on relationships is profound. The people in your life don't really know you. They know the version you've let them see, the version that doesn't cause problems, that agrees more than it disagrees, that needs less than it actually does. They might think the relationship is close, but it's not. Closeness requires honesty, and you've been silencing your honesty to maintain harmony. Self-silencing also creates internal disconnection. When you habitually suppress your thoughts and feelings, you start losing touch with what you actually think and feel. Your internal voice gets quieter. You become unsure of your own opinions because you've spent so long not expressing them. The silencing doesn't just affect what you say out loud. It affects what you allow yourself to think. In romantic relationships, self-silencing shows up as never voicing dissatisfaction, never asking for what you need, never setting boundaries. Your partner does something that bothers you, and you say nothing. They don't meet a need, and you don't mention it. You're trying to be low maintenance, to not be a burden, to keep them from seeing you as difficult. But the result is that they never get feedback. They don't know what you need because you won't tell them. And the relationship can't deepen because you're not bringing your full self to it. The long-term consequence is that self-silencing breeds resentment. You're giving up parts of yourself to maintain the relationship, and eventually that sacrifice starts to feel unfair. You're angry that people don't see your needs, but you never voice them. You're frustrated that you're always accommodating, but you're the one who chose silence. The resentment grows, but you can't express it because expressing it would violate the very pattern that created it. Self-silencing doesn't preserve relationships. It hollows them out. You stay connected, but the connection is based on a false version of who you are. And that falseness, maintained through constant suppression, becomes its own kind of isolation. You're with people, but you're alone with your real thoughts and feelings. The silence you chose to avoid rejection creates a subtler, more persistent form of disconnection that's harder to name and harder to escape. Covert exclusion. Nobody announces it. There's no meeting where they decide you're out. No one tells you you're not wanted. But the invitations stop coming. The group chats you used to be in go quiet, or maybe you're just not added to the new ones. Plans happen, and you find out after. You're being excluded, but it's happening in the gaps, in the things that don't happen rather than the things that do. And because it's covert, you can't even address it without seeming paranoid. Covert exclusion is rejection by omission. It's leaving someone out without explicitly saying so, not inviting them, not including them in decisions, not mentioning plans until after they're made. The exclusion happens through absence, and that absence is designed to be deniable. If you bring it up, they can claim it was an oversight, that they forgot, that it wasn't intentional. But you know it was. What makes covert exclusion particularly damaging is the ambiguity. You can't be certain you're being excluded. Maybe they really did forget. Maybe the group chat was just for that one event. Maybe you're reading too much into it. The uncertainty keeps you from confronting the issue because confrontation requires certainty, and covert exclusion is engineered to deny you that. The exclusion operates through small, repeated actions. You're not invited to one gathering, then another. You notice people making plans in front of you without including you. You see photos from events you didn't know were happening. Each instance alone could be explained away, but together they form a pattern. And that pattern is clear. You're being pushed out, quietly, without anyone having to take responsibility for doing it. What amplifies the damage is that covert exclusion isolates you twice. First, you're excluded from the group. Second, you're isolated from being able to talk about it. If you bring it up, you risk looking oversensitive or accusatory. You're put in a position where you either accept the exclusion in silence or speak up and potentially make things worse. Most people choose silence. The exclusion also leaves you with no path to resolution. In overt exclusion, at least you know where you stand. You can decide to leave, to fight for your place, to address the issue directly. But covert exclusion doesn't give you that clarity. You're left in limbo, unsure whether you're fully out or just being deprioritized, whether you should push back or quietly accept your diminished status. In work settings, covert exclusion shows up as being left off email threads, not invited to meetings where decisions are made, hearing about projects after they've been assigned. You're still employed. You're still technically part of the team. But you're not in the loop. And that exclusion from information is a form of exclusion from power. In social groups, the covert exclusion often serves a function. It's how groups manage their boundaries without explicit confrontation. Someone doesn't quite fit, so instead of telling them directly, the group just stops including them. It's conflict-averse exclusion, designed to push someone out without the discomfort of actually rejecting them to their face. And the cruelty of covert exclusion is that it makes you complicit in your own marginalization. You see the pattern. You know you're being left out, but you keep showing up to the things you are invited to. Keep participating in the parts of the group you still have access to, because fully leaving would require acknowledging that you've been pushed out. And acknowledging it means admitting that the exclusion is real, not just in your head. Defensive withdrawal. You've been hurt before, and you're not letting it happen again. So when someone gets close, you pull back. Not because they did anything wrong, not because you don't want the connection, but because closeness feels dangerous. It creates vulnerability. And vulnerability is what gets you hurt. So you withdraw before they have a chance to reject you. You leave first. It's safer that way. Defensive withdrawal is preemptive distancing. It's pulling away from relationships or situations before you can be hurt or rejected. The withdrawal isn't about disinterest. It's about self-protection. You've learned that getting close to people leads to pain, and you're managing that risk by not getting close in the first place. The pattern is automatic. Someone shows interest in you, and instead of leaning in, you create space. You become less available. You stop initiating contact. You let the relationship cool before it has a chance to heat up. It's not a conscious decision. It's a reflex, triggered by the possibility of rejection. What drives defensive withdrawal is the belief that rejection is inevitable. If people always leave, if closeness always leads to loss, then the logical move is to avoid closeness. You're not being difficult. You're being rational. You're protecting yourself from a pain you've experienced enough times to know is coming. But the withdrawal creates the very outcome it's trying to avoid. When you pull away, people notice. They interpret your distance as disinterest. They stop pursuing connection because it feels one-sided. And eventually, they do leave. Not because they wanted to originally, but because your withdrawal made the relationship impossible. The defensive move designed to protect you from rejection ends up causing it. The withdrawal also limits what you can experience in relationships. You never get to find out if someone might have stayed. You never test whether this relationship could have been different from the ones that hurt you. You're operating on old data, assuming that what happened before will happen again, and that assumption keeps you locked in a pattern that prevents anything new from emerging. In romantic relationships, defensive withdrawal shows up as pulling back the moment things get serious. You are engaged, connected, maybe even happy. But as the relationship deepens, you feel the danger. This matters now, which means losing it will hurt. So you create distance. You pick fights. You become unavailable. You sabotage the relationship before it can reach the point where rejection would be devastating. At work, the withdrawal manifests as avoiding opportunities that would increase your visibility or responsibility. If you never step up, you can't be passed over. If you never volunteer, you can't be rejected. The withdrawal keeps you safe from professional rejection, but it also keeps you stuck in a position where you're never tested, never challenged, never given a chance to succeed. And here's the trap. Defensive withdrawal feels like control. You're choosing to leave, choosing to create distance, choosing to protect yourself. But it's not control. It's reaction. You're not making choices based on what you want. You're making choices based on what you're afraid of. The withdrawal isn't freedom. It's a cage built from old wounds, and every time you pull away, you reinforce the bars. Relational rupture. Something breaks. Not slowly. Not over time. One moment the relationship is intact and the next it's not. Maybe there was a fight. Maybe someone crossed a line. Maybe trust was broken in a way that can't be repaired. The rupture doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It's just a shift, a break in the connection that both people feel but might not name. And once it happens, the relationship is never quite the same. A relational rupture is a sudden, significant break in the bond between people. It's different from gradual drift. Drift is slow, almost invisible. Rupture is acute. There's a before and an after, and the break between them is clear. The relationship existed one way, and now it exists differently, or maybe not at all. What causes a rupture varies. A betrayal. A harsh word said in anger that can't be taken back. A boundary crossed that violates the foundation of trust. The specifics matter less than the fact that something fundamental was damaged. The relationship was built on certain assumptions, and those assumptions no longer hold. The immediate aftermath of a rupture is disorientation. You're trying to understand what just happened. The relationship felt stable, and now it's fractured. You replay the moment, searching for how it went so wrong so fast. But replaying it doesn't undo it. The rupture has occurred, and now you're dealing with the aftermath. What makes ruptures particularly painful is that they often happen in relationships that matter. You don't experience rupture in casual connections because casual connections don't have enough depth to break. Ruptures happen in close relationships where trust and vulnerability are high. And when those relationships break, the damage is severe because you invested deeply. Some ruptures can be repaired. Both people acknowledge what happened. They talk through it. They rebuild trust slowly. The relationship continues, but it's changed. There's a scar where the rupture occurred, and both people know it's there. The relationship might even be stronger in some ways, tested and rebuilt. But it's never the same as it was before the break. Other ruptures are permanent. The break is too severe. Trust is too damaged. One or both people decide the relationship can't continue. And even if they stay in each other's lives in some capacity, the closeness is gone. The relationship exists in a diminished form, a shadow of what it used to be. In friendships, ruptures often come from betrayals of trust, sharing a secret, taking someone's side in a conflict, a pattern of unavailability when support was needed. The friendship doesn't end immediately, but the rupture creates distance that neither person knows how to close. They might still see each other, still talk, but the ease is gone. The rupture stands between them. In families, ruptures can last for years. Something is said or done that violates the relationship in a fundamental way. People stop speaking. Holidays are split. The family fractures around the rupture, and everyone chooses a side. The break becomes part of the family story, a defining moment that shaped who talks to whom and under what conditions. And what makes ruptures difficult to process is that they're often irreversible. You can't unsay the words. You can't undo the action. The rupture happened, and even if the relationship continues, it carries the weight of that break. The knowledge that something that felt unbreakable was, in fact, fragile. That trust, once broken, is hard to fully restore. That closeness, once ruptured, never quite regains its original shape. Anticipatory rejection. You reject yourself before they get the chance. It's a preemptive strike. You see the relationship forming, you feel the connection building, and instead of letting it develop, you start preparing for the end. You hold back. You keep your expectations low. You remind yourself not to get too attacked, because getting attacked means getting hurt when they inevitably leave. The rejection hasn't happened yet, but in your mind, it's already done. Anticipatory rejection is experiencing rejection before it occurs. It's not paranoia. It's a defensive strategy. You've been rejected before, and your brain is trying to soften the blow of the next one by making you feel it in advance. If you're already braced for rejection, the logic goes, it won't hurt as much when it actually happens. But here's what actually happens. You experience the pain of rejection whether it occurs or not. You're living with the emotional weight of being rejected, even when the other person hasn't rejected you. You're mourning the loss of a relationship that's still intact. The anticipation doesn't protect you from pain. It just means you suffer twice, once in anticipation and once if it actually happens. The anticipation changes how you show up in the relationship. You're guarded. You don't invest fully. You keep an emotional escape route open at all times. And the other person can feel it. They sense your hesitation, your reluctance to commit, your constant preparation for exit. That creates distance. Real distance. And sometimes that distance is what triggers the rejection you were anticipating. Anticipatory rejection also distorts how you interpret behavior. Someone is quiet for a day, and your mind jumps to they're pulling away. They're busy one weekend, and you think this is how it starts. Normal fluctuations in availability or mood get read as the beginning of the end. You're so primed to detect rejection that you find it in places where it doesn't exist. In romantic relationships, anticipatory rejection shows up as never fully believing someone when they say they care. They tell you they want to be with you, and part of you thinks for now. They make plans for the future, and you're waiting for them to cancel. You can't accept the relationship as it is because you're constantly preparing for it to become something else, something that ends with you alone. The anticipation also prevents you from enjoying what you have. You're in a good relationship, but you can't relax into it. You're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. The happiness you could be experiencing is undercut by the certainty that it's temporary. And that certainty makes it harder to be present, harder to appreciate the connection while it lasts. At work, anticipatory rejection shows up as never feeling secure in your position. You got the job, but you're waiting to be fired. You completed a project successfully, but you're bracing for criticism. You can't enjoy accomplishments because you're anticipating the moment when your competence will be questioned and you'll be pushed out. And here's the cruelest part: anticipatory rejection doesn't just predict the future. It shapes it. When you're constantly preparing for rejection, you behave in ways that make rejection more likely. You pull away. You test the relationship. You create the very instability you're afraid of. The anticipation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, not because you were right about being rejected, but because your fear of it changed how you engaged with the relationship in the first place. Contingent acceptance. You're accepted, but there are conditions. You can be part of the group, but only if you agree with them. You can be in the relationship, but only if you meet certain expectations. You're wanted, but your value is tied to what you provide, how you behave, whether you conform. The acceptance isn't unconditional. It's transactional. And you know on some level that if you stop meeting the conditions, the acceptance will disappear. Contingent acceptance is inclusion that comes with strings attached. You're valued for what you do, not for who you are. Your place in the relationship or group is conditional on maintaining certain behaviors, meeting certain standards, or providing certain benefits. And that conditionality shapes everything about how you interact. The conditions might be explicit. You can be part of this group if you follow these rules. You can have this relationship if you don't challenge me. You're accepted at work as long as you meet these metrics. The terms are clear, and you know exactly what you need to do to maintain your position. But often, the conditions are implicit. They're never stated outright, but you feel them. You sense that your acceptance depends on being agreeable, on not causing problems, on fitting a certain mold. You learn what's expected through trial and error, through the subtle feedback you get when you step outside the bounds. And once you know the conditions, you adjust yourself to meet them. What makes contingent acceptance exhausting is that it requires constant performance. You're not just being yourself. You're being the version of yourself that earns acceptance. And maintaining that version takes energy. You have to monitor your behavior, suppress parts of yourself that don't fit, perform the role that keeps you included. The acceptance also feels fragile. You know it can be withdrawn if you fail to meet the conditions. So you're always on alert, making sure you're complying, making sure you're not crossing any lines. The relationship or group membership that should feel secure instead feels precarious. One misstep and you could lose it. In relationships, contingent acceptance shows up as partners who love you as long as you meet their expectations. They're happy when you're supportive, attentive, accommodating. But when you express needs, set boundaries, or behave in ways that conflict with what they want, the warmth fades. The acceptance is withdrawn until you return to compliance. You're loved conditionally, and that conditionality makes the relationship feel unsafe. In families, contingent acceptance often revolves around conformity. You're accepted as long as you follow the family's values, pursue the career they approve of, live the life they envision for you. But if you deviate, if you make choices that conflict with their expectations, the acceptance wavers. You're still family, but you're treated as lesser, as disappointing, as someone who's failed to meet the standard. In social groups, contingent acceptance means your membership depends on fitting in. You're included as long as you agree with the group's views, laugh at the right jokes, don't challenge the hierarchy. But if you dissent, if you question the norms, if you assert yourself in ways that disrupt the group dynamic, you risk exclusion. The acceptance you have is real, but it's not secure. It's always dependent on continued compliance. And the damage contingent acceptance causes is that it prevents authentic connection. The relationship is built on performance, not on genuine mutual regard. You're accepted for the role you play, not for who you are underneath. And that means you're always, on some level, alone. Connected to others, but never fully known. Accepted, but only conditionally. Valued, but only as long as you keep earning it. Social comparison threat. Someone else just did what you've been trying to do, and they did it better. They got the promotion you wanted. They're funnier in conversations. They're more liked, more capable, more successful. And standing next to them, you feel yourself shrinking. Not because they did anything to you, but because their success highlights your lack of it. And in that moment, you're not just aware of their achievement. You're painfully aware of your own inadequacy. Social comparison threat is the anxiety and diminished self-worth that comes from comparing yourself to others and coming up short. It's not envy, exactly, though envy is part of it. It's the destabilizing realization that someone else is occupying the position you wanted, performing at a level you're not reaching, being valued in ways you're not. And that comparison threatens your sense of your own worth. The comparisons are automatic. Your brain is constantly assessing where you stand relative to others. It's a survival mechanism designed to help you understand your position in the social hierarchy. But in modern context, that mechanism misfires. You're not competing for scarce resources, but your brain still treats someone else's success as a threat to your own status. What makes social comparison particularly painful is that it's unavoidable. You're surrounded by people. Some of them will be better than you at things you care about. And every time you see that, your brain registers it. Not as neutral information, but as a challenge to your value. Their success becomes your failure, even when the two aren't related. The threat intensifies when the comparison is close. If someone in a completely different field succeeds, it barely registers. But when someone at your level, doing similar work, achieves something you haven't, the comparison cuts deeper. Because the proximity suggests that you should be at that level too. And the fact that you're not raises the question, what's wrong with you? Social comparison also distorts your perception of your own achievements. You accomplish something significant, but instead of feeling proud, you're immediately aware of someone who's accomplished more. The comparison steals the satisfaction. Your success doesn't feel like success when someone else's is bigger, faster, more recognized. You're measuring yourself against a moving target, and the target is always ahead. In professional settings, social comparison threat shows up as constant awareness of your colleagues' progress. Someone gets promoted, and instead of congratulating them, you're spiraling about why it wasn't you. Someone presents a great idea, and you're thinking about why you didn't come up with it first. Your focus shifts from your own work to tracking everyone else's advancement, and that shift undermines your performance. In social groups, the threat appears as hyper-awareness of who's more liked, more interesting, more central. You notice who gets invited to more events, who people laugh with more easily, who seems to effortlessly command attention. And every observation reinforces the belief that you're less valuable, less worthy of the same level of acceptance and regard. The long-term impact of chronic social comparison threat is that it erodes self-esteem. You start defining your worth entirely in relative terms. You're not good or bad in yourself. You're better or worse than someone else. And that means your self-worth is never stable. It's always fluctuating based on how you stack up against whoever you're comparing yourself to in the moment. And here's the trap: social comparison threat makes you focus on the wrong things. Instead of developing your own skills, pursuing your own goals, building your own path, you're obsessed with matching or exceeding what others have done. You're not living your life. You're reacting to theirs. The comparison doesn't motivate you to improve. It just makes you feel perpetually inadequate, perpetually behind, perpetually less than someone else. Interpersonal insecurity. Do they actually like you, or are they just being polite? You can't tell. They smile, they engage, they seem friendly. But underneath every interaction, there's a question you can't answer: are you actually wanted here, or are people just tolerating you? The uncertainty sits in your chest, constant and heavy. You're looking for proof that you belong, but you're equally alert to signs that you don't. And that doubt colors every relationship you have. Interpersonal insecurity is chronic uncertainty about your value in relationships. It's not knowing whether you're genuinely liked or just accepted out of politeness. Whether people enjoy your company or endure it. Whether you're someone's actual friend, just someone they don't want to be rude to. The insecurity makes every relationship feel tentative, conditional, fragile. The uncertainty comes from a lack of internal anchor. You can't trust your own sense of whether you're valued, because that sense has been proven wrong before. You thought you mattered to someone, and it turned out you didn't. Or you thought a relationship was solid, and it dissolved. Those experiences taught you that your perception isn't reliable. So now you're constantly seeking external validation, looking for proof that people genuinely care, but never quite finding enough to quiet the doubt. What makes interpersonal insecurity so disruptive is that it prevents you from relaxing into connection. You're in a conversation, but part of your mind is analyzing whether the other person really wants to be there. Are they checking their phone too much? Is their smile genuine? Are they looking for an excuse to leave? You can't be fully present because you're too busy monitoring for signs of disinterest. The insecurity also drives you to seek reassurance, often in ways that strain the relationship. You ask if everything's okay when nothing is wrong. You need confirmation that people like you, that they're not upset, that the relationship is stable. And while one or two reassurances might be fine, the constant need for validation becomes exhausting for the other person. They start pulling back, not because they don't care, but because managing your insecurity is draining, which confirms your fear that you're too much, that you're not really wanted. In romantic relationships, interpersonal insecurity shows up as never fully believing your partner when they say they love you. They tell you they're happy, and you're searching for evidence that they're lying. They want to spend time with you, and you're wondering when that will change. The insecurity makes it impossible to accept the relationship at face value because you can't trust that their feelings are real or lasting. In friendships, the insecurity manifests as constantly comparing yourself to their other friends. Are you as important to them as they are to you? Do they prefer spending time with others? Would they choose you if they had to pick? You're ranking yourself in a hierarchy that might not even exist, and that ranking always places you lower than you want to be. At work, the insecurity makes you question every professional relationship. Does your manager actually value your work, or are they just being polite? Do your colleagues respect you, or do they see you as incompetent? You're looking for validation in performance reviews, in casual comments, in how often people seek your input. But no amount of external validation fully resolves the internal question: am I actually good at this, or am I fooling everyone, including myself? And the trap of interpersonal insecurity is that it can't be solved from the outside. No amount of reassurance permanently fixes it, because the insecurity isn't about what others think. It's about your inability to trust that what they think is real. The doubt regenerates. Someone tells you they care, and for a moment, you believe them. Then the insecurity creeps back in. Maybe they were just being nice. Maybe they've changed their mind since then. The uncertainty never fully resolves, and that persistent doubt makes genuine connection almost impossible to experience. Face threat. You said something wrong in front of people. Not privately, where it could be corrected quietly. You said it publicly, and now everyone saw it. Your mistake is visible. Your ignorance is on display. And the heat rising in your face isn't just embarrassment. It's the immediate, visceral awareness that your social standing just took a hit. Your reputation, the way people see you, the respect you thought you had, all of it feels suddenly at risk. Face threat is the danger of public damage to your reputation or social image. It's not about private failure. It's about being exposed in front of others in a way that diminishes how they see you. And that threat activates an immediate, intense response because humans are wired to care deeply about how others perceive them. Your standing in the group has survival implications, and when that standing is threatened publicly, your nervous system treats it as a crisis. The threat can come from many sources. You're corrected in a meeting. You make a social blunder at a gathering. You're criticized in front of others. Someone points out a mistake you made and everyone hears it. In each case, the threat isn't just that you were wrong. It's that your wrongness is now part of the public record. People saw it. They're forming judgments. And those judgments affect your position in the social hierarchy. What makes face threat particularly powerful is that it attacks identity. You're not just worried about this one moment. You're worried about what this moment reveals about who you are. If you said something ignorant, does that mean you're ignorant? If you made a social mistake, does that mean you're incompetent socially? The threat to your face becomes a threat to your entire self-concept. The immediate response to face threat is often defensive. You explain. You justify. You deflect. Anything to minimize the damage. Because the longer your mistake sits there, unchallenged, the more it solidifies into how people see you. The defensiveness isn't about refusing to be wrong. It's about trying to protect your standing before it's permanently lowered. But defensive responses often make things worse. Over-explaining makes you seem insecure. Deflecting blame makes you seem unwilling to take responsibility. The very strategies designed to protect your face can damage it further. And now you're dealing with two problems: the original mistake and the poor way you handled it. In professional settings, face threat shows up anytime your competence is questioned publicly. A project fails and the failure is discussed in a meeting. A colleague points out an error in your work in front of the team. Your ideas are dismissed or criticized where others can hear. Each instance threatens your professional reputation, and that reputation determines opportunities, respect, and job security. In social contexts, face threat appears when you violate norms or make mistakes in front of the group. You misread the situation and say something inappropriate. You tell a joke that doesn't land. You show up dressed wrong for the occasion. The group doesn't need to explicitly criticize you. Just the awareness that they noticed that they're judging is enough to trigger the threat response. The long-term impact of repeated face threats is heightened vigilance. You become hyper-aware of situations where your face could be threatened. You avoid speaking up in groups. You're careful not to take risks that could result in public failure. You manage your image constantly, monitoring how you're perceived, adjusting your behavior to minimize the chance of exposure. The vigilance protects you from face threat, but it also limits your authenticity. You're not being yourself. You're being the version of yourself that's least likely to be publicly diminished. Emotional cutoff. The relationship got too painful, so you ended it. Not with a conversation. Not with an explanation. You just stopped. Stopped calling. Stopped responding. Stopped caring, or at least tried to. The connection that was there is severed, and you're not looking back. It's done. They're cut off. And the finality of it feels like relief, at least initially. No more dealing with the hurt. No more investing in something that wasn't working. Just clean separation and the space to move on. Emotional cutoff is the abrupt termination of a relationship without resolution. It's different from a planned ending or a mutual decision to part ways. Cutoff is unilateral, sudden, and final. You don't work through issues. You don't say goodbye properly. You just exit, and the door slams shut behind you. The cutoff usually happens when the pain of staying feels worse than the pain of leaving. The relationship has become a source of hurt. Betrayal, disappointment, conflict, whatever the specifics. And instead of addressing it, you decide the only solution is complete removal. Cut them off and the hurt stops. At least that's the logic. What makes emotional cutoff appealing is its immediacy. You don't have to process complex emotions. You don't have to have difficult conversations. You don't have to negotiate or compromise or work through anything. You just leave. And in the short term, that feels powerful. You're taking control. You're protecting yourself. You're refusing to be hurt anymore. But cutoff has costs that don't appear immediately. You're carrying the unresolved pain from the relationship. The issues that led to the cutoff don't get addressed. They just get buried. And because they're buried, they're more likely to resurface in future relationships. The pattern that caused problems here will likely cause problems elsewhere. But you never learned what your part in it was because you cut off before you had to face it. Cutoff also damages your ability to repair relationships. Not every relationship that hurts is unsalvageable. Some conflicts can be worked through. Some hurt can be healed. But cutoff eliminates that possibility. You've removed the person so completely that there's no path back. And if it becomes a pattern, cutting people off whenever things get difficult, you end up with a trail of severed relationships and no practice in actually resolving conflict. In families, emotional cutoff can last for years or even decades. Someone does something that feels unforgivable and you stop speaking to them. Holidays split. Family events become complicated. The cutoff becomes a permanent feature of the family structure. And while it might protect you from further hurt from that person, it also creates a different kind of pain. The absence of the relationship. The loss of what could have been if repair had been possible. In friendships, cutoff often happens after a betrayal or significant disappointment. They crossed a line, and instead of confronting it, you ghost them. You stop returning calls. You avoid places where you might run into them. The friendship ends, but not cleanly. It just fades into silence with all the hurt and confusion left unresolved. In romantic relationships, emotional cutoff shows up as walking away the moment things get hard. The relationship hits a rough patch, and instead of working through it, you're gone. You don't fight for it. You don't communicate. You just cut it off and move on to the next one, carrying the same unresolved patterns into the next relationship, where the cycle will likely repeat. And here's what makes emotional cutoff dangerous. It feels like strength, but it's often avoidance. Cutting someone off can be the right choice in genuinely toxic or abusive situations. But when it becomes your default response to relational pain, it's not protection. It's a way of escaping the discomfort of actually dealing with conflict, hurt, and repair. The cutoff saves you from one kind of pain, but locks you into another, the pattern of severing connections instead of learning to navigate them. Loneliness triggered by rejection. Rejection doesn't just make you feel unwanted. It makes you feel alone. Not temporarily alone. Deeply, existentially alone. Because the rejection isn't just about this one person or this one group. It confirms something you've feared, that you're fundamentally separate from others. That connection isn't reliable. That you're on your own in a way that feels permanent and unchangeable. Loneliness triggered by rejection is different from ordinary loneliness. Ordinary loneliness is about being physically alone and wanting company. Rejection-triggered loneliness is about feeling alone even when you're surrounded by people. Because rejection teaches you that presence doesn't equal connection. That being around others doesn't mean you belong. That you can be in a crowd and still feel completely isolated. The loneliness hits immediately after rejection, but it lingers long after the rejection itself has passed. The person who rejected you has moved on. They're not thinking about it anymore. But you're left with the emotional aftermath, and that aftermath is a profound sense of disconnection. You feel like you're on the outside of something everyone else is inside of. Like you're watching connection happen for others, but unable to access it yourself. What makes this loneliness so painful is that it's not just about missing people. It's about missing the feeling of mattering to people. Rejection tells you that you didn't matter enough for someone to want you around. And if you didn't matter to them, maybe you don't matter to anyone. Maybe you're the kind of person who's destined to be peripheral, never central, never truly needed. The loneliness also changes how you interact with others. You're more guarded, more hesitant to open up. Because opening up creates vulnerability, and vulnerability led to rejection. So you keep people at a distance, which creates more loneliness, which reinforces the belief that you're meant to be alone. The loneliness becomes self-perpetuating. In social settings, rejection-triggered loneliness shows up as the feeling that you're not really part of things even when you're physically present. You're at the party, but you feel like you're watching from outside. You're in the conversation, but you don't feel connected to it. The rejection has created a barrier between you and others that they might not even be aware of, but you feel it constantly. In professional contexts, the loneliness manifests as the sense that you're isolated within your workplace. Maybe you were passed over for a promotion, excluded from a project, or left out of important discussions. The rejection makes you feel like you're not part of the team in the way others are. You show up. You do the work. But you feel separate, disconnected, alone in a space full of people. The loneliness doesn't just affect how you feel in the moment. It affects your long-term outlook. Repeated rejection-triggered loneliness can lead to a baseline state of feeling fundamentally alone. You stop expecting connection to feel secure. You assume that even when you're with people, you'll still feel isolated. The loneliness becomes your default state, and connection becomes the exception rather than the rule. And what makes rejection-triggered loneliness particularly insidious is that it's invisible to others. They see you interacting. They see you functioning. They don't see the profound sense of isolation you're carrying. So they don't reach out. They don't offer support. And that lack of response confirms what the rejection already told you, that you're alone, and no one really notices or cares. Self-blame after rejection. They rejected you, but the person you're angriest at is yourself. Because you should have seen it coming. You should have been better. You should have said something different, acted differently, been different. The rejection was their decision, but in your mind, it's your fault. You're replaying every interaction, cataloging every mistake, building a case against yourself that's far harsher than anything they said or did. Self-blame after rejection is the tendency to internalize rejection as evidence of personal failure. Instead of seeing rejection as a mismatch, a difference in needs, or a choice the other person made for their own reasons, you see it as proof that something is fundamentally wrong with you. You weren't good enough. You weren't interesting enough. You weren't worth keeping. The self-blame feels logical because it gives you a sense of control. If the rejection was your fault, then theoretically you can fix it. You can be better next time. You can avoid whatever mistake you made. But if the rejection was about incompatibility or circumstances beyond your control, then there's nothing you can do. And that lack of control feels more threatening than blame. So your brain chooses blame because blame at least suggests a path forward, even if that path is built on self-criticism. What makes self-blame particularly damaging is that it's rarely accurate. Most rejections aren't about you being deficient. They're about fit, timing, what the other person needs or wants in that moment. But self-blame doesn't allow for that nuance. It simplifies the rejection into a story where you're the problem. And once that story takes hold, it's hard to dislodge. The self-blame also prevents you from learning anything useful from the rejection. Instead of asking what you could genuinely improve, you're just listing everything you think is wrong with you. The analysis isn't constructive. It's punitive. You're not trying to understand what happened. You're trying to confirm your worst beliefs about yourself. In romantic rejection, self-blame shows up as obsessive analysis of what you did wrong. You replay dates, conversations, texts. You identify moments where you were too eager or not eager enough, too available or too distant. You convince yourself that if you'd just been different, they would have stayed. The blame ignores the possibility that they simply weren't interested, that the chemistry wasn't there, that no version of you would have changed their mind. In professional rejection, the self-blame manifests as assuming you weren't qualified, weren't impressive enough, weren't what they were looking for. You got rejected for a job, and instead of considering that another candidate was a better fit, you decide you're not good enough. You internalize the rejection as a statement about your competence, your value, your worth as a professional. The pattern of self-blame after rejection also affects how you approach future opportunities. If you believe past rejections were your fault, you'll enter new situations already doubting yourself. You'll second-guess your decisions. You'll hold back because you're trying to avoid making the same mistakes. But the mistakes you think you made might not have been mistakes at all. And the self-protection born from self-blame often creates new problems, making future rejection more likely. And here's the cruelest part. Self-blame after rejection doesn't motivate improvement. It paralyzes. When you're convinced the problem is fundamentally who you are, not specific behaviors you can change, you stop trying to change anything. You just carry the belief that you're deficient, that you're the reason relationships don't work, that you're destined to be rejected. The blame doesn't drive growth. It drives shame, and shame doesn't build better relationships. It just makes you smaller. Avoidant coping after rejection. The rejection hurt, and you're not dealing with it. Not directly. You're staying busy. Keeping your mind occupied. Avoiding places where you might run into them. Avoiding conversations about what happened. Avoiding your own feelings about it. You're cupping, but you're coping by not cupping. By pushing it all away and pretending it doesn't affect you as much as it does. Avoidant coping after rejection is managing the pain of rejection by avoiding anything that reminds you of it. You don't process the emotions. You don't talk about it. You don't reflect on what happened. You just move on, or at least you try to, by keeping yourself so distracted that you don't have to face how much it actually hurt. The avoidance feels functional. You're not wallowing. You're not dwelling. You're getting on with your life, and in the short term that looks like resilience. You're handling it. You're fine. But avoidance isn't the same as healing. It's postponement. The pain you're not processing doesn't disappear. It just goes underground, waiting for a moment when your defenses are down. What drives avoidant coping is the belief that feeling the pain fully would be overwhelming. If you let yourself acknowledge how much the rejection hurt, you might fall apart. So you keep it contained. You distract yourself with work, with new relationships, with activities that keep your mind too busy to wander back to what happened. The avoidance protects you from the intensity of the pain, but it also prevents you from working through it. The avoidance also shows up in how you talk about the rejection, if you talk about it at all. You minimize it. It wasn't a big deal. I'm over it. It was for the best. You're not lying exactly. You're just not letting yourself feel the full weight of what happened. And that minimization keeps others from offering support, because you're signaling that you don't need it. In romantic rejection, avoidant coping manifests as immediately jumping into dating again. Not because you're ready, but because being single reminds you of the rejection, and dating distracts you from that reminder. You're using new connections to avoid processing the loss of the old one. And that avoidance means you're bringing unresolved feelings into new relationships, which makes those relationships harder to sustain. In professional rejection, the avoidance shows up as throwing yourself into work after being passed over for a promotion or losing a job. You're productive. You're focused, but you're also avoiding the feelings of inadequacy, disappointment, or anger that the rejection triggered. And because you're not processing those feelings, they leak out in other ways. Irritability. Burnout. Difficulty enjoying successes because you're still carrying the weight of the unprocessed failure. Socially, avoidant coping after rejection appears withdrawing from the social scene where the rejection occurred. You stop going to certain places. You avoid mutual friends. You create physical distance because emotional distance feels impossible. The avoidance protects you from reminders, but it also isolates you from potential support and from opportunities to rebuild your social confidence. The problem with avoidant coping is that it works until it doesn't. You can distract yourself for weeks, months, maybe longer. But eventually something triggers the pain you've been avoiding. A song, a place, a comment. And when it surfaces, it often feels as raw as it did when the rejection first happened because you never actually processed it. The avoidance didn't heal the wound. It just kept you from looking at it. And here's what makes avoidant coping after rejection so persistent. It's reinforced every time it temporarily works. You distract yourself, and the pain recedes. You avoid the reminder, and you feel better. The relief is immediate, which makes avoidance feel like the right strategy. But the relief is temporary. The pain returns. And each time it does, you have to work harder to avoid it. The coping mechanism that started as protection becomes a prison, keeping you from ever fully processing and moving past the rejection. Need for approval. You're watching for reactions. Not just hearing what people say, but scanning their faces for signs of approval. Did they like what you said? Are they impressed? Do they think well of you? The conversation continues, but part of your attention is locked on tracking whether you're being accepted or judged. And that need for confirmation, for validation, for approval, shapes every word you choose and every stance you take. The need for approval is the drive to gain positive evaluation from others. It's not just wanting people to like you. It's organizing your behavior around securing their approval. What you say, how you act, the opinions you express. All of it gets filtered through the question, will this get me approval or cost me approval? The need usually develops from environments where approval was conditional. You learned early that acceptance depended on meeting certain standards, pleasing certain people, performing in certain ways. Love and belonging weren't guaranteed. They were earned, and that lesson stuck. Now, even in contexts where approval isn't conditional, you're still performing for it. What makes the need for approval so consuming is that it's never fully satisfied. You get approval today, but that doesn't guarantee you'll have it tomorrow. So you have to keep earning it. Keep monitoring for signs you're losing it. Keep adjusting your behavior to maintain it. The approval you're seeking is a moving target, and the pursuit is exhausting. The need also distorts how you make decisions. You're not choosing based on what you want or what you believe is right. You're choosing based on what will get you approved of. Someone asks your opinion, and before you answer, you're calculating what they want to hear. You're not being dishonest, exactly. You're just prioritizing their approval over your own authentic response. In social settings, the need for approval shows up as people-pleasing. You agree when you'd rather not. You laugh at jokes that aren't funny. You go along with plans you're not interested in. Because disagreeing, not laughing, saying no, all of that risks disapproval. And disapproval feels like rejection. So you mold yourself into someone agreeable, even when that means sacrificing what you actually want. At work, the need manifests as constant vigilance about how you're perceived by supervisors and colleagues. You're not just doing your job. You're doing it in a way that earns approval. You stay late not because the work requires it, but because it signals dedication. You take on extra projects not because you're interested, but because saying yes gets you approved of. Your professional life becomes a performance designed to secure positive evaluation rather than an expression of your actual capabilities and interests. In relationships, the need for approval creates imbalance. You're so focused on being liked, on being wanted, on being approved of that you don't assert your own needs. You accommodate. You defer. You make yourself easy to be with by never causing friction. And while that might secure approval in the short term, it prevents genuine intimacy. Because intimacy requires showing who you really are, including the parts that might not be universally approved of. The long-term cost of living for approval is that you lose touch with your own preferences, values, and identity. You've spent so much energy tracking what others want from you that you've stopped tracking what you want for yourself. The need for approval doesn't just shape your behavior. It erodes your sense of self. You become a reflection of what you think others want to see, and the person underneath that performance gets buried. Fear of negative evaluation. You're about to speak in a meeting and your throat tightens. Not because you don't know what to say, but because everyone's about to hear you, and everyone's about to judge you. What if what you say sounds stupid? What if they think you're incompetent? What if you reveal in this one moment that you're not as capable as they thought? The fear isn't about the content. It's about the evaluation. And that fear is strong enough to make you consider staying silent. Fear of negative evaluation is the dread of being judged unfavorably by others. It's not concern about getting things wrong. It's terror about being seen as wrong, as incompetent, as lesser. The fear targets your social value, and in situations where that value is on display, the anxiety spikes. The fear is anticipatory. It's not a response to actual criticism. It's the expectation that criticism is coming, and that expectation is powerful enough to interfere with performance. You're so worried about being judged that your cognitive resources get diverted away from the task and toward managing the fear, which makes mistakes more likely, which gives people something to actually criticize. The fear creates the very outcome it's trying to avoid. What amplifies the fear is that negative evaluation feels permanent. One bad impression, and that's how people will see you forever. One mistake, and you're marked as incompetent. The fear doesn't allow for the possibility that people forget, that judgments shift, that a single moment doesn't define you. It treats every evaluative situation as make or break. The fear also makes you hypervigilant to feedback. You're not just listening to what people say. You're analyzing tone, body language, pauses, searching for signs of judgment, and when you're looking for negative evaluation, you find it. A neutral comment feels like criticism. A lack of praise feels like disapproval. The fear magnifies every possible signal that you're being judged poorly. In performance contexts, presentations meet interviews, The fear shows up as intense anxiety that undermines your ability to perform well. You know the material. You're prepared. But the moment you have to deliver in front of others, the fear takes over. Your mind goes blank. You stumble over words. You forget points you wanted to make. The fear doesn't just make you nervous. It actively sabotages the performance it's worried about. In social situations, the fear makes you quiet. You have thoughts, but you don't share them because sharing means being evaluated. You want to contribute, but contributing risks being judged negatively. So you hold back, watching the conversation happen without you. Thinking about what you could have said if you weren't so afraid of how it would be received. The fear also prevents you from taking risks. You don't volunteer for challenging projects because challenging projects have a higher chance of failure, and failure means negative evaluation. You don't try new things because new things mean you'll be a beginner, and being a beginner means performing poorly in front of others. The fear keeps you in your comfort zone, not because that's where you want to be, but because that's where you're least likely to be judged. And what makes fear of negative evaluation so persistent is that it's almost never fully disproven. You can perform well and get positive feedback, but the fear tells you that's just luck, that next time you won't be as fortunate. The fear doesn't get quieter with success. It just shifts its focus to the next evaluative situation. You're never free from it because there's always another context where you could be judged, and the possibility of negative evaluation never goes away. Relational ambivalence. You want them close. You also want distance. You crave connection. You also need space. You're drawn to intimacy. You're also terrified of it. The feelings pull in opposite directions, and you can't reconcile them. You're stuck in a state of wanting and not wanting the same thing at the same time, and that contradiction makes every interaction feel unstable. Relational ambivalence is having conflicting feelings about a relationship. You care about the person, but you're also frustrated, resentful, or uncertain. You want the relationship to continue, but you're also considering ending it. The ambivalence isn't indifference. It's simultaneous attraction and repulsion, connection and withdrawal, wanting more and wanting out. The ambivalence usually signals unresolved tension in the relationship. Something isn't working, but it's not bad enough to end things. Or something is good, but not good enough to make you feel secure. You're caught between what the relationship gives you and what it costs you, and neither side is strong enough to override the other. What makes ambivalence so disorienting is that it doesn't resolve. You're not moving toward clarity. You're oscillating. One day you're certain you want to stay. The next day you're thinking about leaving. The uncertainty becomes the defining feature of the relationship, and that uncertainty prevents you from fully committing or fully exiting. The ambivalence also affects your behavior in inconsistent ways. Sometimes you lean in, seeking closeness. Sometimes you pull back, creating distance. Your partner or friend can't predict which version they're going to get, and that unpredictability creates strain. They don't know where they stand with you, because you don't know where you stand with yourself. In romantic relationships, ambivalence shows up as constantly questioning whether this is the right relationship. You have good moments, and you think, yes, this is it. Then you have difficult moments, and you think maybe not. The back and forth is exhausting, and it prevents you from building the security that relationships needed to deepen. You're always 1 foot in, 1 foot out, ready to commit or ready to run depending on which feeling is stronger in the moment. In friendships, the ambivalence manifests as fluctuating investment. Sometimes you're fully engaged, available, present. Other times you're distant, unavailable, pulling away. The friend doesn't know which version of the friendship they have, and that inconsistency makes it hard for them to invest deeply. They're dealing with your ambivalence even if you're not telling them about it directly. With family, relational ambivalence often comes from a mix of obligation and genuine care. You love them, but you also find them difficult. You want to stay connected, but you also need boundaries they don't respect. You're caught between wanting the closeness families are supposed to have and needing the distance that makes the relationship tolerable. The damage ambivalence causes is that it keeps you stuck. You can't move forward because part of you is pulling backward. You can't leave because part of you wants to stay. The relationship exists in a state of perpetual uncertainty, and that uncertainty prevents growth, depth, and resolution. You're not choosing. You're just oscillating. And that oscillation over time becomes its own form of suffering. Social withdrawal. You're pulling back. Not dramatically. Not with an announcement. Just quietly reducing your social contact. You decline invitations more often. You don't initiate plans. You let friendships drift without trying to maintain them. It's not that you hate people or want to be completely alone. You're just tired. Tired of performing. Tired of managing social dynamics. Tired of the vulnerability that comes with being around others. So you withdraw. And the space you create feels like relief, at least at first. Social withdrawal is the deliberate reduction of social interaction and engagement. It's not isolation imposed by others. It's isolation you're choosing, usually as a response to feeling overwhelmed, hurt, or unable to navigate social demands. You're stepping back from the social world because being in it has become too costly. The withdrawal often starts as temporary self-protection. You've been hurt, or you're exhausted, or you need a break from social performance. You tell yourself it's just for now, just until you feel better. But temporary withdrawal can become permanent. The longer you stay withdrawn, the harder it becomes to re-engage. Social skills atrophy from disuse. Anxiety about re-entering social situations builds. What started as a break becomes a lifestyle. What drives social withdrawal is usually a combination of factors. Maybe you've experienced rejection and you're protecting yourself from future hurt. Maybe social interaction has become draining and you don't have the energy for it. Maybe you feel like you don't fit anywhere and you've stopped trying to find a place. The specifics vary, but the result is the same. You're removing yourself from social contexts. The withdrawal provides immediate relief. You're not dealing with the pressure of social performance. You're not managing the anxiety of being judged. You're not navigating the complexity of relationships. You're just alone, and alone feels simpler, safer, less demanding. But the relief is short-term. Over time, social withdrawal creates its own problems. Loneliness sets in. The isolation that felt protective starts to feel like a prison. You want connection, but you've been withdrawn for so long that reaching out feels impossible. You've built a wall between yourself and others, and now you're on the wrong side of it. Social withdrawal also changes how others see you. They stop inviting you because you always say no. They stop reaching out because you never respond. They're not rejecting you. They're just respecting what seems like your preference for being left alone. But inside, you might be hoping someone will push through your withdrawal, and when no one does, it confirms the fear that drove the withdrawal in the first place, that you don't really matter to anyone. In professional contexts, social withdrawal shows up as disengaging from colleagues. You don't join lunch groups. You don't participate in casual office conversations. You do your work, but you're not part of the social fabric of the workplace. And while that might protect you from office politics and social stress, it also limits your opportunities. Relationships matter in professional advancement, and withdrawal cuts you off from those relationships. The challenge with social withdrawal is that it's self-reinforcing. The more you withdraw, the less practice you have with social interaction. The less practice you have, the harder social interaction feels. The harder it feels, the more you withdraw. The cycle tightens, and breaking it requires confronting the very thing you've been avoiding, the discomfort and vulnerability of being with people. Attachment avoidance. Some people let others in easily. They form close bonds. They're comfortable with intimacy. They don't panic when relationships deepen. But if you have attachment avoidance, none of that comes naturally. Closeness feels suffocating. Vulnerability feels dangerous. When someone wants more from you emotionally, your instinct isn't to give it. It's to pull away. Not because you don't care, but because caring too much, needing someone too much, letting them need you. All of that feels like a threat. Attachment avoidance is a pattern of discomfort with intimacy and emotional closeness. It's not about being antisocial or hating people. It's about managing the anxiety that comes with deep connection by keeping emotional distance. Closeness requires vulnerability, and vulnerability means risk, and risk feels intolerable. The pattern typically forms from early experiences where closeness wasn't safe or reliable. Maybe caregivers were unavailable emotionally, and you learned that depending on people leads to disappointment. Maybe intimacy came with conditions or invasion of boundaries, and distance became protection. Whatever the origin, your system decided that independence is safer than connection, and it built defenses around that decision. What makes attachment avoidance functional in the short term is that it works. You don't get hurt in relationships because you're not fully in them. You don't feel abandoned because you never let yourself depend on anyone. You maintain control by keeping people at arm's length. The strategy protects you from the pain that closeness can bring. But avoidance has costs that accumulate. Relationships stay shallow. You have people in your life, but no one really knows you. You're friendly, capable, independent on the surface. But there's a core part of you that never gets shared. And that isolation, even when self-imposed, creates its own suffering. Humans need connection. The need doesn't disappear just because you've decided closeness is dangerous. Attachment avoidance also distorts how you perceive relationships. When someone wants more intimacy, you might see them as needy or clingy. When they express emotional needs, you might view those needs as weakness or excessive demands. Because you've organized your life around not needing anyone, people who do need connection seem fundamentally different, and that difference becomes a reason to maintain distance. In romantic relationships, attachment avoidance shows up as an inability to commit deeply. You might be in a relationship, but you keep part of yourself separate. You don't talk about feelings. You don't share vulnerabilities. When your partner wants more emotional intimacy, you feel crowded and pull back. The relationship exists, but it never reaches the depth your partner is seeking because depth requires the vulnerability your avoidance is designed to prevent. The avoidance often manifests as a preference for independence. You value your autonomy. You don't want to be tied down. You need your space. These aren't inherently problematic. But when they're driven by avoidance, they're not really about independence. They're about fear. Fear of needing someone. Fear of being needed. Fear of the loss of control that comes with deep emotional investment. And the painful irony is that attachment avoidance is designed to protect you from rejection, but it creates a form of isolation that feels remarkably similar to the rejection you're avoiding. You're not being left by others. You're keeping yourself separate preemptively, in ways that prevent real connection from forming. The avoidance keeps you safe from acute hurt, but locks you into chronic loneliness. Interpersonal distance regulation. There's an invisible boundary around you. Not physical, emotional, and you're constantly managing it. When someone gets too close, you step back. When they're too distant, you might reach out, but carefully. You're regulating how close people can get, and that regulation is happening constantly, often below your conscious awareness. The distance isn't random. It's strategic. And it's designed to keep you safe from the vulnerability that closeness creates. Interpersonal distance regulation is the unconscious management of emotional closeness in relationships. Everyone does it to some degree. But for some people, the regulation is rigid, driven by anxiety about intimacy, and it shapes every relationship they have. You're not letting people in fully, not because you don't want connection, but because the system that's supposed to protect you has decided that too much closeness is dangerous. The regulation operates through subtle behaviors. You share, but only to a point. You're warm, but not too warm. You engage, but you maintain an invisible barrier that others can feel even if they can't name it. When someone tries to get closer, asking personal questions, seeking emotional support, expressing affection, you deflect. You change the subject. You make a joke. You create just enough distance to keep the intimacy from deepening past your comfort threshold. What drives distance regulation is usually fear. Fear of being hurt. Fear of being controlled. Fear of losing yourself in the relationship. Fear of being known too fully and rejected for what's underneath. The distance protects you from those fears by preventing the conditions that would activate them. If no one gets too close, no one can hurt you in the ways that closeness makes possible. The regulation also operates as an automatic response to perceived threat. Someone expresses strong feelings for you, and you feel an urge to pull back. Not because you don't reciprocate, but because their feelings create pressure, expectation, vulnerability, and your system responds to that vulnerability as a threat that needs to be managed through distance. In friendships, distance regulation shows up as keeping relationships at a friendly but surface level. You're pleasant. You're available for certain activities. But when the friendship tries to deepen, when someone wants to talk about real problems or share real struggles, you find ways to redirect. You're good at being a casual friend. You're uncomfortable being a close one. In romantic relationships, the regulation creates frustration for both people. Your partner wants more emotional intimacy, and you're pulling back without fully understanding why. You care about them. You want the relationship, but you also need the distance. And that need feels non-negotiable, even when you can see it's creating problems. The regulation keeps you safe, but it keeps the relationship from reaching the depth that would make it satisfying for both of you. The challenge with interpersonal distance regulation is that it's largely unconscious. You're not deciding to keep people at arm's length. It's happening automatically, driven by systems that formed before you were old enough to examine them. And because it's unconscious, it's hard to change. You can know intellectually that you keep people at a distance, but knowing doesn't override the automatic response that creates the distance in the first place. And the long-term cost is that the distance regulation prevents you from experiencing the full range of what relationships can offer. Deep connection requires vulnerability. Intimacy requires letting someone see you fully. Love requires allowing yourself to need and be needed. But distance regulation blocks all of that. You stay safe. But you also stay alone in ways that persist even when you're surrounded by people who care about you but can never quite reach you.